Good morning to those of you participating in the Western Hemisphere. Good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe and in Africa. And good evening to those who are in Asia. Today is the second day of the Schiller Institute's International Conference, Inspiring Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. My name is Dennis Small. I am the head of the advisory committee of the LaRouche Legacy Foundation, or LLF. We are gathered today on September 11th, Sunday, September 11th, 21 years after the infamous Reichstag fire type incident, which ushered in a new age of an attempted global police state designed to implement the policies of fascist restructuring of the world economy, which the City of London and Wall Street intend. That policy, started 21 years ago on that point, on that way, has come of age today with what has been going on around Ukraine, with Ukraine serving as a kind of cat's paw, as we've been discussing through the discussions yesterday, to try to implement a total silencing, not simply of free speech, but the actual debate of ideas which are required to pull humanity out of its current crisis. We do not agree with that ban on debates or ideas, quite the contrary. The subject of this panel is the historic launch and the exciting occasion of the LaRouche Legacy Foundation's digital LaRouche Library, and appropriately so in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the birth of that abiding universal genius, Lyndon LaRouche. And this is an event which I am quite convinced, for some of the reasons I've just mentioned, has the enemies of mankind from Satan on down trembling in their boots. LLF's stated mission at its formation at the end of 2019, at the initiative of its founding director, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, was to preserve and extend the monumental intellectual contributions in innumerable fields of knowledge and endeavor of Lyndon H. LaRouche. At that time, we committed ourselves, among other tasks, to begin publishing Lyndon LaRouche's collected works and to prepare a complete digital archive of his life's work. We knew from the outset that this was going to be a daunting task, to put it mildly, and we had to locate, digitize, preserve, and make available to the world public free of charge the entire corpus of Lyndon LaRouche's prolific intellectual output over more than 50 years. This includes, we have discovered, over 2,600 articles published in EIR magazine, going back to 1974, perhaps another 2,500 articles published in the Federalist, the New Federalist, New Solidarity, Solidarity newspapers, dozens and dozens of books, hundreds of articles published on critical issues of science and culture in magazines such as Fidelio, 21st Century Science, Fusion Magazine, and so on, and well over 1,000 videos. We don't even know the full count yet of Mr. LaRouche's speeches, his conference speeches, his classes, his foreign trips, his seminars, his webcasts. There are hundreds of audio tapes, thousands of pictures. You get the idea. We are also convinced that we will be uncovering heretofore unpublished and even unknown writings by Lyndon LaRouche. And a large part of that total material has to be digitized, old videos, old newspapers, before they can be made available to the public. Thanks to the generous contributions and bequests to LLF, which is a 501c3 tax-exempt public charity, we are able to open the doors to the LaRouche Library today with just a very small sampling of what will be coming. There are currently 272 articles from EIR, barely 1/10 of that area alone, 22 videos, some 60 photographs, and so on. My colleague John Sigerson, whom you will be hearing from shortly, suggested that I should publicly comment and commit to getting all of LaRouche's works uploaded to the LaRouche Library, at least before the completed works of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz are fully curated and published, which, as you may know, has been going on for quite some time. And so I do, so long as all of you continue to provide us with the wherewithal to carry out that job. Here's what we have in store for you today. First, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founding director of LLF and Lyndon LaRouche's wife and closest political and philosophical collaborator for decades, will talk about why this digital LaRouche library is so urgently necessary in the current strategic situation of the world. After that, we will hear from Lyndon LaRouche himself, an 82-minute-long video composed from his remarks to about 7 different nations in the world. Then John Sigerson will give you the world's first guided tour of the LaRouche Library. And finally, Gretchen Small will provide a brief overview of the upcoming Volume 2, a preview of it, of the Volume 2 of the collected works of Lyndon LaRouche. And we will then have a brief question and answer period. So without further comments, I would like to turn the floor over to Helga Zepp-LaRouche.
Hello, good day. I have today a very good thing to do. I'm extremely proud and happy to have the fantastic task, what Dennis already pre-announced, but to announce to you the participants of this conference commemorating the 100th birthday of Lyndon LaRouche, my late husband, and the world, the opening of the digital library of his work, both in written, audio, and video form. As Dennis just said, this means that from now on, students and scholars, as well as ordinary citizens, will have the access to his enormous production of ideas. This fact is absolutely revolutionary because the international oligarchy has run a huge concerted international operation to suppress not only his writings, but even his existence. And maybe only historians will find out one day how that was the most elaborate operation to suppress the ideas of an individual ever. So now, in every country around the globe, people will be able to access eventually, and I disagree with Dennis in terms of the number of books. I think it will be hundreds of books, thousands of articles, numerous of recorded speeches and lectures. And what you will find when you do that, well, many people who knew him personally have stated repeatedly that he was the most educated, most knowledgeable person they ever met. I had the fortune of traveling together with him to many countries. It's probably around 40 of them. And what always struck me, and naturally also other people, was that he was able to talk with the most diverse groups of people. Let it be scientists in Russia, fishermen in Peru, shoemakers in Italy, military men in France, political leaders from Africa, philologists in India, musicians from many countries, historians from Europe, engineers and farmers from the United States, industrialists from Germany, and the list could go on for a very long time. And he would always leave his interlocutors with the impression that he was an expert in their field, knowing more about the matter than they themselves. Just to give you one example, after he spent 2 full days of discussion about the principles of classical musical composition, Motivführung, and the art to understand the intention of the composer, with nobody else but the very, very top artist, world artist Norbert Breinin, the first violinist of the famous Amadeus Quartet and decade-long friend of his, Norbert concluded that Lynn knew more about music than him. And that means a lot because Norbert Breinin was a genius in his own field. But despite his universal knowledge, there was not one iota of arrogance or ego in him, in Lynn that is. He lived so much in the heights of ideas that he was able to evoke in his discussion partners a creative spark, a self-subsisting impulse to think with greater clarity, so that the person he was speaking with always would feel self-elevated, motivated to explore new areas of knowledge and different viewpoints. In this way, he touched the lives of a very large number of people in his long and extremely productive life. He was truly a universal thinker, proving that despite the complexities of our times, that it is absolutely possible to know the essential fields of knowledge, and that the compartmentalization of experts was not the fate of somebody who mastered the method of acquiring knowledge, rather than being a Brotgelehrte, somebody who only works for his money, and that he was truly a philosophical mind in the way Schiller talks about in his essay, Why Do We Study Universal History? Naturally, he was primarily an economist. Readers of the digital library will be able to find an unparalleled account of both the evolution of the science of physical economy from the ancient roots in astronomy, geometry, city building, infrastructure building, etc., as well as the foundations of physical economy in Leibniz, Hamilton, Liszt, Carey, Witte, and related scientists such as Gauss, Riemann, Vernadsky, or Einstein, as well as the theoretician of the opposite, oligarchical school of slave-holding societies and empires, such as the different schools of the physiocrats, monetarists, and proponents of the free trade doctrine. He obviously revived the almost forgotten knowledge about the fundamental difference between the American and the British system of economy. If any student wants to learn how to build a successful economy for his or her country, LaRouche has provided the historical examples as well as the theoretical building blocks to do so. Given the obvious crisis of economic science, where none of the established schools, from the Austrian school to the Chicago one, from the Keynesians to the Friedmanites, have been approximately able to have a correct prognosis about the economy. The study of LaRouchian economics is obviously a must for anybody who wants to avoid the bungling of a Paul Volcker or a Robert Habeck. Just think of the many economists who wrote shortly before the systemic crisis of 2007-8 that from now on the boom would go on forever and that everybody could become a millionaire by making the right investments in the stock market. But also the student of universal history will find an unmistakably guideline to study the evolution of the oligarchical system, which he described, for example, as a slime mold, which over the centuries may change color and shape, but which essentially always remains in the same character, being a slime mold. Namely, a system where a small oligarchical elite tries to keep all the privileges for themselves and whose basic interest is to keep the population as backward as possible. This system was the dominant form in much of the world until the 15th century, when the emergence of the sovereign nation state for the first time produced the idea of the common good as the purpose of the state. And since these two orientations, the oligarchical versus the nation state, have been in a continuous battle, still waiting to be decided. The writings of LaRouche provide a pathway from the early forms of civilization to the essential battles of especially European history of the last 2,500 years. Based on his profound knowledge of history as essentially a battle of opposing ideas, he was able in an amazing way to conceptualize any new historical occurrence. When others were puzzled by sudden changes in the strategic or political situation, he was able to place this event and give it a proper name. The reason for this capability had again to do with his method of thinking, which had to do with his total mastery of the universe of Platonic ideas and all major thinkers who followed in that tradition, such as Augustinus, the controversies among the Neoplatonists, Nicolaus of Cues, Kepler, Leibniz, etc., as well as his understanding of the complex domain and the thinking in terms of analysis situs, a notion coming from the geometric considerations of Leibniz. A whole other area of different strategic proposals and policy outlines, which, even if they were made for specific historic situations, still contain valid principles which are applicable today. One such example is the Strategic Defense Initiative, which, even if it was designed as a solution to the middle-range missile crisis between NATO and the Warsaw Pact in the beginning of the 1980s, and for the Reagan presidency and the Soviet government at that time, it still remains the most elaborated proposal to establish a new international security and development architecture to replace the curse of geopolitics until the present day. It contains the essential idea that the only realistic form of disarmament is the agreement to make nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction technologically obsolete and to enter a form of cooperation which takes both into account the interest of the other, as well as it grants more benefit to all sides than to maintain the adversarial position. It will be surprising for many to see that LaRouche's familiarity with the most profound principles of poetry, drama, and music are as deep as the knowledge of the universal principles in the sciences. And it is only from that standpoint that he was able to overcome methodologically the artificial division between Naturwissenschaften and Geisteswissenschaften, which had developed in Europe since the times of Savigny and Kant. The continuous interest of LaRouche, however, was with the issue of creativity per se, as that specific capacity which separates the human species from all other living forms of existence. He was therefore most concerned about all aspects and processes which further that creativity of the human mind, and equally about those which lower that capacity as something which had to be overcome. So if the student wants to find the key to his own creativity, there is no better way than to study LaRouche, who was convinced that every human being has the potential to become a genius, even if that may take many different forms, since in the realm of creativity, the degrees of freedom are limitless. I have to issue a warning at this point. When I asked Lynn once how it came that he had become such an all-rounded genius, covering so many areas of knowledge, making so many fundamental breakthroughs in so many fields, he had a very sobering answer. He said, "It's a lot of work." Thank you.
That's for sure. And see, there you have it. 30 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago, at the beginning of this panel, I was under the belief that we had dozens of books of LaRouche that are known that we had to make sure got up on the new LaRouche library. And Helga, who is by far the best informed on this, has now told us that we're probably looking at hundreds. And I'm sure she's right. So there is a lot of work to be done. For those of you who have just joined us, you are listening to panel 3 of the Schiller Institute conference, Inspiring Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. This is our third panel, presenting the digital LaRouche library, LaRouche in Dialogue with the Nations of the World. I should inform you as well that this entire conference, both days, is being simultaneously interpreted into Spanish, French, German, and Italian. And that also is one of the tasks which down the line we have taken up in the LaRouche Legacy Foundation to make sure that we get adequate translations of Lynn's works also available over the course of the development of this project. Now, you are now going to have the privilege of traveling with Helga LaRouche to some 7 nations in different parts of the world, where you will hear and see the way they live. Our intention here is twofold. First of all, to provide you with a small sample of what will eventually be available on the LaRouche Library site. Now, these are just excerpts from 7 much longer videos out of 1,000 or more full-length videos that will eventually be up on the site. Our second intention here is to present you with Lynn's in-depth discussion of the most profound and thorny issues facing mankind. You will be able to look over Lynn's shoulder, so to speak, as he deals with the rest of the world. As Helga was saying, from scientists to economists, trade unionists to students, elected officials to royalty. Yes, royalty, literally. And you'll begin to get an inkling of why in nation after nation around the world, Lyndon LaRouche's interlocutors viewed him as what they wished the United States to be, and therefore the best hope for changing the world for the better. Frequently, you will hear them blurt out, "Mr. LaRouche, if only you were the president of my country." Or, more to the point, "I wish you were president of the United States." And so he should have been. Over the course of decades, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche traveled to over 40 countries on every continent. If you can put up the table which we prepared, I would appreciate that. In the course of these travels, they met with dozens of presidents and prime ministers, some of them in office, some not. Among the most famous are their meetings with India's Indira Gandhi and Mexico's José López Portillo, as well as Lynn's conversation with Ronald Reagan. The list which you see on the screen compiles a list of those meetings, including those with direct envoys of the LaRouches, which were held on one occasion or another. Now, the video which you are about to see includes Lyndon LaRouche's discussion with audiences in 7 countries, as I mentioned, including those nations which, with the United States, comprise the 4 powers proposal of LaRouche: Russia, India, China, and of course the United States. In some cases, these were visits made in person. Others were conducted by video conference. In most cases, being foreign countries, there are interpreters involved, and that will be unmistakable. Some of what you are about to see has never been broadcast before. There are 2 specific matters by way of background that I'd like to mention to you about the video, because I think it is very useful to help understand what is going on. In Russia, you will see Lynn having an exchange with, among others, Dr. Pobisk Kuznetsov, one of Russia's most distinguished scientists and visionaries. Kuznetsov subsequently proposed that Lyndon LaRouche's fundamental breakthrough in the science of physical economy, his discovery of potential relative population density as the best metric of human creative progress, was so significant in science that it required that a new unit of measurement be established and that it be named for Lyndon LaRouche. He proposed calling it the La for LaRouche. Then in Brazil, Lyndon LaRouche in June 2002 was made an honorary citizen of the city of Sao Paulo, one of the largest in the world, at the initiative of the Prona party of Dr. Enéas Carneiro. And Lynn and Helga traveled to Brazil on that occasion. 4 months after that visit, in October of 2002, Enéas was elected to Brazil's Congress with the single largest number of votes ever cast for a representative of Congress in the entire history of Brazil. Enéas spent a grand total of about $20,000 on his campaign. And he habitually campaigned by holding up copies of LaRouche's magazine, Executive Intelligence Review, and advising everyone to follow LaRouche's policy proposals. At the meeting in the Sao Paulo City Council, where LaRouche was made an honorary citizen, and you will see some excerpts of this, Enéas delivered a speech on what he called, "Who is Mr. LaRouche?" Or as he put it, "Who is Mr. LaRouche?" And this included a detailed explanation of why Lyndon LaRouche placed such great emphasis on the catenary to understand both physical geometry and strategic statecraft. And now sit back, do not relax, concentrate on Lyndon LaRouche for the next 80 minutes and have fun.
Señoras y señores, tengan ustedes muy buenas noches. A nombre del Comité de Finanzas, tengo la grata satisfacción de darles la más cordial bienvenida.
It is my pleasure to welcome you to the fifth session of this committee, wherein you will be witnessing an international internet conference transmitted from the United States of America, which we have titled International Finance and Economic Development for the Americas, with the participation of Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, Jr., international economist, financial expert, and a candidate for the Democratic nomination to the Presidency of the United States of America.
We're in a situation in the world now which can best be described as being at the brink of a disintegration of the existing world financial system and monetary arrangements. This is not a matter of predicting the day of a crash. The crisis is systemic, it is not cyclical, and there is no possibility that the world system in its present form could survive the immediate period ahead. This is a result of a change which occurred especially since August of 1971, when the world abandoned a workable system set up by U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, called the old Bretton Woods system. There were many injustices practiced, especially toward developing nations, under that system. But the system itself worked, with some reservations, up until about the middle of the 1960s. In 1971, President Nixon took the first step to end the condition of fixed currency rates or adjustable fixed currency rates by a floating exchange rate system. Since that time, the progress that was made in the United States, Europe, and to some degree elsewhere under the post-war monetary system ended. Since about 1971-72, in point of fact, the world has become generally poorer. We've been living off past capital investment, past real physical capital, draining it down. We've now reached the point, through a series of steps, at which the system is doomed. Now, what we have at the moment is a situation best compared to Germany in 1923, especially during the period from the spring and summer into the autumn of 1923. We're in that kind of situation now. Since especially 1997, with the troubles, so-called troubles in Asia, and then the crisis of mid-1998, the world has entered the terminal phase of this sick system. However, like the German authorities in 1923, the central banking systems and other institutions have been pumping monetary aggregate into the system at fantastic rates and looting everything in sight to maintain this. So therefore, we cannot exactly predict the day this system will collapse. Any accident can cause it to collapse. But generally, we can say this is going like the 1923 hyperinflation in Germany. The madmen will keep pumping the money in to try to keep the system afloat from one day to the next until the system simply disintegrates, or until some event in the meantime intervenes to bring the system down. Therefore, we must expect that we're going to have to face the reality of a general reorganization of the world financial and monetary and trade system in the near future. We will have to scrap globalization. We will have to return to a system of relatively fixed parities among currencies. And we're going to rely largely upon reestablishing the role of the perfectly sovereign nation state and its sovereign currency and monetary system as the partner or the system of partners which will build the new system. What we will have to do is to essentially revive the pre-1971 or pre-1966 type of Bretton Woods system on a global scale. And I would propose there are a number of differences that have to be included in that. First of all, we'll have to repeat the successful experience of the post-war period up till 1971, because that for us is a proven precedent of a workable system. Extending this system to include developing countries in a way we did not in the post-war period is one of the fundamental changes that have to be made. For example, I've emphasized that you cannot build a workable system without including major powers such as China and India as partners in managing the new monetary system. We're going to have to put much of the world through financial bankruptcy reorganization. Much of the world's debt, including the so-called derivatives and related debt, will simply have to be written off. This is now totaled well over $300 trillion of short-term debt in a world whose estimated global gross domestic product is in the order of 11 trillion. Obviously, you cannot carry this debt. Other debt will have to be organized, especially honorable debt, especially the debt of governments. However, we have to recognize, for example, as in the case of the states of the Americas, that under the floating exchange rate system, if you look at the figures, you find out that the nations of the Americas have paid more in debt retirement than they have received in total debt due to them formerly or in the subsequent period. This anomaly has developed precisely because every time there was a run on Ibero-American currencies in international markets, international authorities would come to these countries and tell them to devalue their currency and take other measures, but at the same time not devalue the debts which had been denominated earlier, the foreign debts. And therefore this rewriting of foreign debt and the issuance of new credit against this rewriting caused a debt crisis such that the Ibero-American states have paid more in debt retirement in the past 30 years than the total debt which is actually incurred by them. So much of this debt will have to be reorganized. The ideas of His Holiness Pope John Paul II for a Jubilee year will have to be examined as one of the measures. The other side of this is we're going to have to reorganize our approach to an economy. We're going to have to go through a fixed exchange rate system to an emphasis on long-term credit, not loans, but long-term credit, trade credit, by which, in particular, developing nations, which need capital imports, will be able to buy these on long-term credit of 1% interest per annum or that order, and with some grants as well, in order to incur capitalization in the order of 5 to 10 to 15, 20, or 30 years, as in the terms of long-term infrastructure. In other words, we must think about building up economies which could not pay such things now, to the point that in the future, through the increase of their productive powers of labor, they are able then to retire some of that capital debt incurred through these long-term extensions of low-cost credit. So therefore, we need that kind of a system. Also, we cannot do this under the present trends of globalization. You must have protectionist policies for all nations. Otherwise, they cannot guarantee the prices for their export commodities which will enable them to meet the old debts or reorganized debts and also carry the new debt incurred through long-term credit at low interest rates. Therefore, we must have a protectionist policy, particularly in respect to building up the infrastructure of countries which are largely importing countries, technology importing countries, to building up their agricultural systems through necessary capital technology imports, to building up their private businesses and their government businesses through these measures, to increase generally the productive powers of labor in these economies. And this means essentially, in my view, that countries such as the United States or the core countries of Western continental Europe, to some degree Russia, which has a large technological potential if it is mobilized, and Japan are going to have to specialize in building up their capacity to export high-grade technology goods and also exporting long-term credit to countries which are presently classed as developing or semi-developing countries. Therefore, we will need a new international division of labor. We're going to have to think in terms of 20 to 30 years of rebuilding and building the world economy. And under those conditions, we can prosper. We must, however, in the meantime, apply some new conceptions as to how to do our financial accounting. Instead of counting things merely in prices, money prices, we're going to have to think in terms of physical content and the functional nature of physical content of these of costs. Now, what I would do on the question of the Americas as such under that arrangement is, as I proposed back in 1982 in a book which was called Operation Juarez, which had some popularity in the hemisphere at that time, but not with Henry Kissinger, that what we should sponsor is a special monetary trade arrangement, within the Americas, among the states of the Americas, which the United States could co-sponsor. And on some general idea and agreement on development projects, we would then be able to write off paper on a long term at nominal charges and use otherwise unpayable debt as a negotiable asset, financial asset, which is then used for the purposes of facilitating these kinds of long-term investments and long-term credit structures. Now, for example, let's take the case of Peru concretely. Peru, anyone who's been there, as I have some years ago, knows exactly what infuriates me as an economist about seeing the condition of Peru. And when I look back to these aerial maps of what Peru was a long time ago, before the Spaniards arrived there, a long time before, we realize that this area, which is now considered semi-arid and undeveloped, can be developed. And if we look at the sources of water in the area, if we look at some of the undeveloped areas, the highland areas, we realize that Peru is an excellent investment proposition if it's given the means to build the infrastructure and also get the credit to develop the kinds of industries which fit its opportunities and which enable it to raise its productive powers of labor. Take an example of this. These institutions are generally associated with what's called Project Democracy or the National Endowment for Democracy. They're offshoots. The International Republican Institute and similar things on the Democratic Party side are of that species. Now, I've known this group for a long time, and they're not exactly the people I'd recommend. For example, this is the same group which is pressing for legalization of drugs in the hemisphere, as in Colombia, for example. They would like to do the same in Peru. They would like to bail out Ecuador by using Ecuador in great trouble, bordering the Amazon region, to bring Ecuador into a functioning part of a big surge of cocaine and heroin production in this part of the world. They don't like Peru because they don't like the fact that the Peru defended itself against Sendero Luminoso and its offshoots so successfully some time ago under a president who I think has behaved courageously and correctly in that situation. This idea, anybody who proposes the legalization of drugs, as some people in the United States, including people associated with the Carter Group implicitly, are doing, or the International Republican Institute, in Colombia and elsewhere, are doing the same thing to the Americas and to the United States too, but to the Americas, that the Palmerston and the British East India Company did to China in the 19th century. Palmerston's demand, which was the issue of the wars against China, was demand that the Chinese legalize drugs. The Chinese did so under gunboat pressures, and they destroyed China internally, and it took a long time before China was restored. The same thing is being done in the case of the Americas. So what they do is they take a government like the government of Peru, which defended itself ably with its military, with limited resources, against a major threat. It may not have eliminated the threat, but it brought it under control. And you compare the condition of Peru today with that in Colombia, where we know that our friends in Colombia had essentially the same ideas as the people in Peru, but in Colombia they weren't able to carry it out. In Peru they did. Some people cannot forgive Peru that. It's that simple. Now, this is an old problem in society. Until certain developments in Europe, that every form of society was based on the overlordship of the people of society by a small group of oligarchs. The oligarchs, with their trusted lackeys, treated the rest of the population as human cattle. Now, the greatest contribution of European civilization to that.
I największą jakby wkładem cywilizacji europejskiej w tę część ludzkiej historii
Came out of the classical Greek tradition in part. As example is the famous poem of Solon of Athens. The other thing was the development of Christianity.
Potem do tego doszła tradycja chrześcijańska.
And particularly as developed in the epistles of the Apostle Paul.
A zwłaszcza tradycja, która wychodzi z listów świętego Pawła.
Out of which we got a concept which originally was Greek, which was given in European civilization a Christian form, which was called in Greek agape.
Która po grecku nazywa się agape.
That is the law.
I to jest prawo.
That is natural law.
To jest naturalne prawo.
Therefore we say that in a crisis the obligation is the obligation to serve the common good. This is not merely fairness in a dispute.
To nie chodzi tutaj tylko o pewną uczciwość w dyspucie, w sporze.
This is the function of wiser men in society to lead society, to understand that what we must protect is not merely the rights of the living. We must protect the process of development upon which the continuation and betterment of society depend. Look at, for example, two nations on East and South Asia.
Popatrzmy na dwa narody w Azji Południowo-Wschodniej.
China and India.
Chiny i Indie.
China has the world's largest population.
Chiny to jest największa liczba ludności na świecie.
India has a population which will reach over a billion very soon.
Indie mają ludność, która bardzo szybko dojdzie do miliarda.
India has some high technology, but it also has a vast army of greatly poor.
Indie dysponują bardzo nowoczesną technologią w pewnych miejscach, ale z drugiej strony mają ogromną też armię bardzo, bardzo biednych ludzi.
China has developed high technology capabilities, but the future of the Chinese population depends upon the development of the inland areas and the desert areas and the mountainous areas.
Ale przyszłość Chin zależy od możliwości rozwijania interioru, a także, w tym także terenów pustynnych i terenów górskich w głębi kraju.
So these are countries which have some high technology capability, but not enough to meet the needs of their populations as a whole. If we're going to reorganize the world financial and economic system, what we would wish to do is take the areas which formerly have produced high technology, as in the United States, in Western Europe and Japan.
Tak jak w Stanach, w zachodniej Europie czy Japonii.
And increase our production of technology in cooperation with parts of the world that need this technology.
Trzeba zwiększyć wydajność tej nowej technologii we współpracy z tymi obszarami, tymi regionami świata, które takiej technologii potrzebują.
This will require long-term credit system,
To by wymagało kredytów długoterminowych,
generally reaching to a periods of 25 to 25 years, in other words, a generation.
generalnie tak długich jak powiedzmy całe pokolenie, 20-25 lat.
This means interest rates, simple interest rates on the order of 1%.
Oznacza to, że oprocentowanie musiałoby być bardzo skromniutkie, rzędu 1%.
And long-term agreements, especially in infrastructure development and in new technologies. Think in the case of Poland, for example.
Popatrzmy na przypadek Polski.
How many revolutions have the Polish people fought to struggle for independence?
Ile tutaj rewolucji było, żeby się wybić na niepodległość?
Why did those fighters who died for that do that?
Dlaczego ci, którzy za to zginęli, to robili?
As instinct, like animals? No.
Instynkt mieli jak zwierzęta? Nie.
They fought to save the people and the nation. They were willing to sacrifice their lives.
Oni walczyli po to, żeby była z tego korzyść dla ludzi, dla narodu. Chcieli się poświęcić.
Without that, since the Mongol invasion, there would have been no Poland.
Gdyby nie to, to od czasów mongolskiej inwazji Polska by nie istniała.
And when you think of the people who did that, and you know many of them, and some of you were those people in the former time, the last Hitler period, and dealing with the recent regime here.
Macie bardzo wiele przykładów takich ludzi, jak się przypatrzcie w tył, ludzi, którzy walczyli za Hitlera, za okupacji, za ostatniej także reżimu.
It meant something. The life of the person who took the risk of doing that meant something to take that risk.
To przecież miało jakieś znaczenie. To, że ludzie byli gotowi poświęcić swoje życie w przeszłości, było rodzajem przekazu, jakiegoś komunikatu, który chcieli nam przekazać na temat znaczenia ich życia.
How many people today would stand up to the same challenge?
Ilu ludzi dzisiaj podjęłoby to samo wyzwanie?
So therefore, a great crisis is an advantage, and it forces us and forces the little people to pay attention to what some of their leaders have been telling them.
Wielki kryzys jest w takim oglądzie, staje się pewną okazją, która budzi ludzi, która mówi właśnie tym ludziom, którzy sami na małość się skazali, że oto przychodzi czas, żeby coś zmienić i żeby posłuchać ich przywódców, że oni coś mają do powiedzenia, jeżeli tacy się pojawiają.
Great tribulations sometimes come as a blessing.
Chcę powiedzieć, że wielkie takie zaburzenia czasami pojawiają się jako rodzaj błogosławieństwa.
If there are prophets to awaken the people to what their true interest is. There's some people here in this room would be very happy for Poland to make its own policy.
Zresztą to, że za siebie myśleć i własną politykę robić, to jest rzecz, za którą wielu tęskni. Tu w Polsce i myślę, że na tej sali jest wielu ludzi, którzy bardzo chętnie powitaliby sytuację, w której Polska mogłaby sama decydować o własnej polityce.
But it must ask the permission of the European...
Ale musicie prosić o pozwolenie Brukseli.
From the IMF, from the European Union.
Z Europy, z Zachodniej, z Międzynarodowego Funduszu Walutowego.
You want schools for your children, you have to get permission from the European Union.
Chcecie mieć cokolwiek zrobić, to musicie pytać o pozwolenie z Europy w tej chwili.
You want to have a currency, you have to get permission from the IMF.
Nie macie pieniędzy, chcecie mieć jakieś rozwiązania monetarne, musicie prosić o to pozwolenie z Międzynarodowego Funduszu Walutowego.
So our problem is, I've discussed in general terms, there is a solution for this mess. Put the thing through bankruptcy under what we call Chapter 11 principle of the United States.
A zatem, tak jak mówię, istnieje rozwiązanie jednak dla tej sytuacji. Otóż spróbujmy popatrzeć na zbliżający się kryzys jako na możliwość zadziałania w sytuacji bankrutującego systemu i zastosować do niej tak zwany rozdział 11 Konstytucji, ustawy o bankructwie w Stanach.
Adopt a new policy of reconstruction centered on the idea of developing cooperation in Eurasia.
Pomyśleć o nowej polityce odbudowy, spróbować ją wmontować w koncepcję nowego rozwoju w skali całego megakontynentu eurazjatyckiego.
Develop the great cultural dialogue between Europe and East and South Asia.
Rozwinąć wielki dialog kulturalny pomiędzy Europą i Azją Wschodnią.
And do this with the idea that this is the way to organize a benefit for the entire world.
A przede wszystkim wyjść z taką ideą, jako że ona jest z korzyścią dla wszystkich, dla całego świata.
That is consistent with what we call the common good.
To się zgadza z ideą dobra wspólnego.
That's consistent with what John Paul II has called the common good.
To się zgadza z tym, o czym mówi papież Jan Paweł II, zasadą dobra wspólnego.
Therefore we should do it.
A zatem zróbmy to.
Where do we get the permission to do it?
Ale czy pozwolą to zrobić?
And in the meantime, what do we do?
Co w międzyczasie mamy zrobić?
Well, I'm an old fighter.
Ja jestem cały czas, walczę cały czas.
I'm impatiently patient.
Ale jestem niecierpliwie cierpliwy.
I'll continue the fight.
Dalej będę walczył.
I will not complain if we don't win tomorrow morning.
Nie będę się skarżył, jeżeli jutro nie zwyciężymy.
I'm determined we're going to win the war, though.
I'm determined to
win the war.
Aha, natomiast mam wolę wygrania wojny.
I can't tell you what day.
Nie mogę powiedzieć kiedy.
I can't promise.
Nie mogę obiecać.
I can tell you how we're going to win the war, though.
Mogę natomiast powiedzieć, w jaki sposób zamierzam wygrać tę wojnę.
And tell you to stay at it until we win.
I powiedzieć państwu, żebyście trzymali się, dopóki nie zwyciężymy.
That, of course, is an old Polish custom.
To jest zresztą zgodne ze starym polskim zwyczajem.
That's why Poland exists. So, therefore, what we need is the clear ideas.
To, czego najpierw na początek potrzebujemy, to jasne idee.
We need the ideas that we would want to have from the prophets.
Idee, których nie otrzymamy od proroków.
We must work for those ideas in whatever we can, way we can, day by day.
Musimy dla tych idei, te idee wypracowywać z dnia na dzień, cały czas, codziennie.
We must be prudent but bold at the same time.
Musimy być ostrożni, roztropni, ale jednocześnie otwarci cały czas.
We must be bold above all in the area of ideas.
Przede wszystkim musimy być uczciwi w zakresie idei.
And we must see ourselves as merely a part of humanity which has been on this planet for a long time.
Musimy patrzeć na siebie jako na taką część ludzkości, która na tej planecie jest już od bardzo dawna.
And we must look at ourselves as this part of humanity as God looks at this part of humanity.
I musimy patrzeć na siebie jako na tę część ludzkości, tak jak i Bóg na nas patrzy.
We must say, what does God say our mission is for existing in our time?
Musimy zdać sobie sprawę z tego, jaka jest misja powierzona nam przez Boga na egzystencję w tym czasie.
And we must accept that responsibility with joy.
I musimy z radością zaakceptować taką odpowiedzialność, jaka z tego wynika.
I think we can win soon.
Sądzę, że wkrótce zwyciężymy.
The main thing is to have fraternity among us, among nations.
Najważniejsze jest, żebyśmy mieli braterstwo i taką szczerość między sobą, między narodami.
And share with John Paul II.
I dzielili ją z Janem Pawłem II.
The idea which he's expressing in action now.
Ideę, która wyrażana jest w tej chwili w działaniu.
God looks at us in our time.
Bóg na nas patrzy w naszych czasach.
What is our mission in our time?
Jaka jest nasza misja?
Let that be our joy. Thank you.
Sprawmy, żeby była radością naszą.
Regarding your prescription for the future, first of all, I fervently wish that we see you in the White House in 2004. That in that high position you will help implement the idea which you mentioned about nation states in your concluding part of the address.
Thank you very much. Now, 20 years later, the world has changed. It was done specifically with the idea Mrs. Gandhi was then Prime Minister, and our intent was to provide through her. We've had discussions before in earlier times, and it seemed that the most useful thing we could do for India, since she was disposed to know about such things, was to provide something that she and her associates could use in India to devise a plan for India. Because we thought that the long-term view was needed. And we saw that about 2 generations be required to realize anything that India would accept as a long-term view. And she, of course, was sympathetic because she would always look at the poor of India as her reference point. If it doesn't benefit the poor, there's something wrong. And that's my view. That if it doesn't benefit the poor of India to elevate their station, we fail. If you benefited the poor and uplifted them, well, then you're moving the whole country in the right direction. And it would take, because we would see things as Mrs. Sampson pointed out to us at one of the villages we visited. You could see the problem of the teachers in trying to get the parents to accept that bringing the children to the schools, which the schools teachers were devoted to trying to help these students, these young fellows. So that in order to make the revolution in India that was required, you would have to actually motivate a process in which education would really take off and people would understand the importance of supporting it. So we said 40 years, and then some of the things that are required, there were 2 or 3 generations required. So it's still relevant. I would simply situate it the same way of thinking, with some of the same objectives today. My view of relations is largely a spiritual one, in my sense of the term spiritual. And that is the cognitive powers of mind must be engaged. You must engage in transmitting concepts back and forth, not just words, not information. And my concern has been to establish relations, re-establish relations with people who think, who are the thinkers, typical thinkers of India, knowing that the radiation of thinking among thinking people is the way in which science works and which politics really works. And therefore I was more concerned to have the opportunity to report on certain things which I thought Indians ought to hear from me, because I'm prepared to tell the truth, whereas some other people from my country are not. And the Indians should have the advantage of hearing some of the truths of the matter, so they could judge for themselves how to look at some of these problems. So maybe that is spiritual. What do we think? To engage, to set forth channels for the future where we're more efficiently engaged in communicating ideas which might lead to useful results. My view is Russia is a Eurasian nation. It is not simply in Europe and Asia, but it is Eurasian in character. It has Eurasian instincts as a nation, as a national body. It has ties to Russia, to China, to India, to other countries, which are crucial, which are unique. That doesn't mean that India and China always agree with Russia. But it means it's a bridge country between Western Europe and the countries of East and South Asia. And therefore, in a sense, my concern is to get Russians to adopt that view, and thus to help to bring together, for example, let's take the question of bilateral relations between China and India, which are much discussed here, and I suppose are much discussed in China as well. How do you deal with the fact that, especially since 1962, there has been a continuing sense of a potential military conflict between Russia and China, China and India, which affects all of us? How do you bring these nations together? How do you define a common interest over and above this continuing issue of conflict?
I must introduce myself as Professor Gretchen. Generally, Yadav, former Union Minister, ex-member of Parliament, as my secretary sitting by my side. I think that you are visiting India after 20 years. 17 years. Even that is a very high. I wish you could visit more often to this part of the world, not only India, Russia, Southeast Asia, China. Because as you rightly said that this part of the world will play a very important role in shaping the new just economic order.
What I shall do today is present the evolution of the policy which is presented to us by the coming visit of the President of China. The history of it, as I was personally involved in developing that policy over a long period of time, partly as a personal effort and later as an effort which began to make some impact on the shaping of the policies of the world during the course of the 1980s. The intent of London, the intent of the British Commonwealth, is to do to China what they did to the Soviet Union. That's their policy. Above all, they do not wish to allow the United States to enter into a partnership with China, which is an alliance, in effect, among two nations seeking to find global stability and global economic growth. And thus, China is besieged and threatened on every border. That's changing. What's happened in Taiwan recently with George Soros and company collapsing the Taiwanese economy as he participated in collapsing the Southeast Asia economies has had a political effect in Taiwan. But from every part of Asia, we can trace British intelligence operations, supported in part by some scoundrels from the United States, such as George Bush and his brother Prescott, which are attacking China, trying to destroy it. You have a pro-British faction in Japan, which wants to make trouble. You have in the Congress, members of the Congress who never had a passport before the end of the Congress. And they're now trying to make foreign policy. Most of them don't even know where countries outside the United States are. But they have strong opinions on the subject. Their ignorance strengthens their opinion. There's instability in Central Asia. It's a cockpit of trouble. There are threats to China from all around it, launched largely by British intelligence and by the British Commonwealth operations. So China's a besieged nation. Okay, now I'll have played briefly a section from a televised press conference which I conducted in Berlin on Columbus Day, October 12th, 1988, at the Bristol-Kempinski Hotel. This is the same televised press conference which was later rebroadcast in the United States during October the same month as part of a nationwide campaign, election campaign, my campaign. This is the actual genesis. This broadcast and what led into it is the actual genesis of the program I've just described or identified, and is the genesis of the policy thinking which must go into the design of the agreements reached between the President of the United States and the President of China. Proceed.
Under the proper conditions, many today will agree that the time has come for early steps toward the reunification of Germany, with the obvious prospect that Berlin might resume its role as the nation's capital. For the United States, as for Germans and Europe generally, the question is, will this reunification process be brought about by assimilating the Federal Republic into the East Bloc's economy or economic range of influence? Or can it be accomplished in a different way? In other words, is a united Germany to come into being as a part of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, as President de Gaulle proposed, or as Mr. Gorbachev has desired, a Europe from the Urals to the Atlantic? I see the possibility that the process of unification could occur precisely as de Gaulle proposed.
What I'd forecast at that point was that in the remainder of that address, is that during the coming months, that we would see the disintegration of the former Soviet bloc for economic reasons. This disintegration would begin politically in Poland, would spread through Eastern Europe, and that the United States and Western Europe must prepare for this process of disintegration of the Soviet-dominated economic zone, and that the United States must support the early reunification of Germany under these conditions, and that that proposal should be made in the context of offers by the United States and others to assist the states of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in economic recovery by helping them correct some of the faults in their system. It happened, as we know, the following year. At that point, I turned to my wife, and Helga, and we discussed the implementation which had to be, this is the point the wall was beginning to crumble, the measures which must be taken by the United States and Europe, Western Europe, in order to deal with the disintegration which is ongoing in the former Soviet bloc. The proposal that came from that first was called the European Triangle Proposal. There we have that. That there is an area in Western Europe, an approximate spherical triangle whose key points, whose vertices, are Paris, Vienna, and Berlin. This is the historic, represents the historic concentration of infrastructural and related economic and technological development in Europe, which has been the greatest in the world. Here was embedded at that time in 1988, 1989, was embedded the greatest potential for machine tool technologies, radiation from Europe into Eurasia. And my proposal was the United States had to enter into an agreement with these nations of Europe in order to establish partnership with this triangle zone in order to extend development corridors based on transportation corridors, including the technology of magnetic levitation rail, or rail substitute, into St. Petersburg, into Moscow, etc., down through Italy and so forth, and beyond, as a great development project. And therefore, the crucial thing to all of these parts of the world, whether it's Africa, South Asia, East Asia, is to provide to these sectors of the world the right to development. The right to development involves education, infrastructure development, and above all, the machine tool design capability without which you cannot have continuous sustainable development. Thus, that was the principle of the sector. That by developing land routes of efficient, high-speed transportation throughout Eurasia, and using these routes not only to support trade and industry, but to support the transmission at a high rate of the machine tool design sector into these countries, then and only then would it be possible to lift the greatest part of the world population, which is concentrated in South and East Asia, and also in Africa. Secondly, to lift these parts of the world out of the legacy of 19th century imperialism and the legacy of second-class citizenship in world affairs.
Я свой герой. Мы представляем нашему уважаемому гостю Lyndon. There are two things which are of concern to me in being in Russia this week.
Дело в том, что я на этой неделе нахожусь в России, и меня волнуют две проблемы.
Not only in Russia, but in the world as a whole, we
have the greatest crisis of the 20th century.
Не только в России, а во всем мире в целом мы видим развитие самого крупного кризиса 20 века.
I think you are acquainted with the situation of the former Soviet Union.
Я думаю, что вы хорошо знакомы с ситуацией в бывшем Советском Союзе.
It's a disaster. It cannot continue. It would become irreversible. Those of you, like my friend Bobisk, who are veterans of World War II,
Если вы, такие же, как мой друг Побис, который является ветераном войны,
lived through a certain experience.
И это означает, что это означает определенный жизненный опыт.
Experience of the 20s, 1920s.
Это опыт, который пережили мы в 20-е годы,
as boys,
когда мы были еще мальчишками.
Lived through the 1930s as adolescents.
Потом мы были подростками в 30-е годы.
Lived through the war.
Мы пережили войну.
Served in uniform.
Мы служили в армии.
And the post-war period.
Мы пережили послевоенный период.
Now, the world, as it's known to people who were born after the war,
Мир в том виде, который он известен людям, родившимся после Второй мировой войны,
is absolutely different than those of us who lived through the Depression and war.
Совершенно отличается от того мира, которым он был во время депрессии и во время Второй мировой войны.
In our time, during the Depression and war, we were giants compared to what came after.
Во время депрессии и во время Второй мировой войны мы были гигантами по сравнению с тем, чем мы стали позже.
And take two examples. Take Russia and the United States.
Возьмем лишь два примера. Возьмем Россию и США.
In the 1939, the United States had been through a depression for 10 years.
К 1939 году США уже десятый лет переживали депрессию.
We had mass unemployment.
У нас была массовая безработица.
We had misery.
У нас были очень несчастные люди.
We had people who had gone more or less insane because they had lost their dignity.
У нас некоторые люди сошли в какой-то степени с ума, потому что они потеряли свое собственное достоинство.
People with advanced degrees in sciences couldn't get jobs, hardly use dishwashers.
Люди, которые имели университетские степени в естественных науках, не могли получить соответственную работу, им приходилось мыть посуду.
In 1939-1940, Roosevelt launched the United States on a great industrial development program.
А в 1939-1940 году Рузвельт принял кампанию и начал осуществлять кампанию индустриального развития, национального индустриального развития.
It was for purposes of war.
Для целей войны.
We took 17 million people out of the labor force and put them in uniforms, military service.
17 миллионов людей из производственного сектора перешли в армию и надели военную форму.
Women replaced them in the factories.
А на заводах их заменили женщины.
In 4 years, from a bankrupt United States, we created the greatest industrial machine on this planet.
И за 4 года из страны банкрота США создала очень мощную мощную экономическую машину.
After the initial defeat in 1941,
после первых поражений 1941 года,
a similar, more agonizing experience occurred in the Soviet Union.
Аналогичный агонистический опыт был пережит и в Советском Союзе.
People with their bare hands made an industrial war machine.
Люди просто одними руками создавали индустриальную военную машину.
For every Wehrmacht soldier who died on the Russian front, 10 Russians died.
И одного немецкого солдата вермахта, который умирал, умирали 10 человек российских, советских военных.
It was a great heroic mobilization.
Это была великая героическая мобилизация.
It was not pretty.
Это все не очень здорово выглядело.
It was monstrous.
Это выглядело совершенно жутко.
It was war at its most intense.
Это была ужасная интенсивная война.
Yet the beautiful thing was that people were capable of doing it.
Но самое хорошее, что стало ясно, это то, что люди могли это все осуществить.
And then in the immediate period after the war.
А теперь и также за периодом, который последовал непосредственно после окончания войны.
Peace came, but there was no peace.
Мир пришел с одной стороны, с другой стороны мира не было.
The ruined country was rebuilt with bare, bleeding hands by hungry people.
И разрушенная страна была восстановлена чисто руками людей, которые еще не всегда были сыты.
So people who lived through that experience, as in the United States or Russia,
И люди, которые пережили это как в США, так и в России,
know what people and nations can do in the face of a crisis like that we face today. What was this based on? The progress before farmer progress.
на чем же основывался прогресс до сегодняшнего дня?
Two things.
На двух вещах.
The universalization of education or movement in that direction.
Введение всеобщего образования или, во всяком случае, работа в этом направлении.
The first standard of ability of freedom is the ability to read and write.
Первый уровень, первая обязательная, так сказать, предпосылка свободы – это умение читать и писать.
That is to communicate ideas.
То есть, иными словами, возможность передавать свою мысль, излагать свою мысль.
The second standard is a process of education in which the student relives in the mind the greatest discoveries of principle of history before.
Это такой модель образования, когда ученик создает в своем сознании первое открытие, сделанное величайшими учеными.
Because a child who relives the great discoveries, reenacts in the child's own mind the great discoveries in geometry and other things of the past thousands of years, is reliving the experience not only of the storehouse of human knowledge, but is learning how to discover.
Дело в том, что ребенок, который переживает или проходит через этапы открытия, которое было сделано, может быть, несколько лет назад, он проживает практически пятитысячную историю цивилизации, которая насчитывает 5000 лет. И он не только приобщается к этим открытиям, он понимает, как нужно делать это, каким образом делается открытие.
A student who memorizes a mathematics physics textbook is probably not good for physics.
Человек, студент, который лишь запоминает содержимое учебника по физике и математике, может быть, и не очень хороший студент, может быть, он не годится для физики.
The student who works through in his own mind the crucial discoveries of principle in physics is a physicist.
А тот студент, который в своем уме проживает и проходит, повторяет тот опыт, который прошел открыватель того или иного закона, как раз он и является хорошим физиком.
He has not just learned ideas, he has learned how to discover.
То есть он выучил не только идеи, он понял, как делается открытие.
And this was called a classical humanist education.
И это называлось классическим гуманитарным образованием.
So, when you have a great number of children
И когда мы имеем большое количество детей,
with that kind of education,
вот с образованием такого рода,
in a society which offers them the opportunity to use that education,
и они живут в обществе, которое предоставляет им возможность использовать, применять это образование,
both to participate in production,
то есть как участвовать в производстве,
and to participate in running the society.
И участвовать в управлении обществом,
participate in making the policy of the society by discussing the policy.
Позволяет участвовать в разработке политики этой страны и в принятии решений по политике.
Then no longer is a peasant an ox.
Тогда уже крестьянин не остается быком.
He becomes a creative personality.
Он становится творческой личностью.
Who can increase the productive powers of not only himself but his neighbors.
Который может увеличить производственные силы, потенциал не только самого себя, но и своих соседей.
And thus, these ideas of education around discovery and art, discovery and science, the idea of using these discoveries to improve the power of man over nature, to investment in scientific and technological progress. This is the difference between man and the beast.
И вот эти просветительские идеи, которые заключаются в том, что человек учится делать открытия, человек получает образование как гуманитарное, так и науки, именно это дает человека от животного.
For example, remember when Kennedy announced the U.S. space program, manned landing on the moon?
Вы помните, когда Кеннеди объявил американскую космическую программу о высадке человека на Луне?
Remember in Russia, Sputnik in 1957.
Помните российский спутник, 1957 год?
Remember the optimism of hearing that silly beep.
Вы помните оптимизм, который был связан вот с этим сигналом, который подавал спутник?
Remember the optimism among the U.S. population when Kennedy announced the manned landing on the moon.
И помните, какой был оптимизм американского населения, когда Кеннеди объявил программу высадки на Луне?
Remember the excitement in 1969 when man first stepped foot on the moon.
И помните, какое было волнение в 1969 году, когда нога человека первый раз ступила на Луну?
Look at that statue of Yuri Gagarin.
И посмотрите на статую Юрия Гагарина.
Remember when it was put up? Why?
Помните, когда ее поставили и почему?
Because it was a source of inspiration to the Soviet population.
Потому что это был источник вдохновения для советского населения.
It made it good to live in such times. If we can be conscious of this and what these things mean, I think we can win.
Если бы мы осознали это и понимали, что все это значит, я думаю, что мы могли бы выиграть.
That's the main purpose of my work here.
И это основная цель моей работы в вашей стране.
Может быть, попросим ответить на вопросы, господин Ларуш, если такие есть. Да, пожалуйста. Раз Василий, если бы были такие кандидаты в президенты в России.
If only there were candidates for president.
До чего мы не видим подобного? Вот таким. Я думаю, что ваш великий друг, товарищ Побис Кузнецов, я назову его фамилию, потому что вы ее не назвали.
And I think that your friend Pobis Kuznetsov, and I mentioned his name, which you didn't say.
Я думаю, что он подтвердит, что был такой на земле, на советской земле, великий человек.
I think he will back me up in saying that there was in the Soviet Union a great man.
Его зовут Александр Александрович Фетисов.
Named Fekisa.
Он рожден был в 12 году.
He was born in 1920.
Он воевал в Японии.
And he fought on the front against Japan.
Он был моряк. Он был
Navy man.
Он был начальником службы тыла Тихоокеанского флота.
He was the head of the rear services for the
А потом он занялся системным анализом.
After which he went into systems analysis.
У меня вопрос. Все, кто занимается системным анализом, это плохие люди?
My question is, are all people who do systems analysis bad people?
No, they're just white people who drink too much whiskey. But the distinction is this.
Значит, ключевое различие заключается в следующем.
The point is that you have today most mathematicians, when they get their doctoral degree in mathematics, pure mathematics, go insane if they haven't done it before.
Дело в том, что в основном сегодня математики, которые пишут и получают докторскую степень, они чистые математики. Они в основном сходят с ума, если с ними этого не произошло раньше. Почему?
The question of development takes you outside of mathematics.
Вопрос развития выводит вас за пределы математики.
You take the last words of Riemann's famous habilitation dissertation.
Давайте возьмем последние слова докторской диссертации Римана, квалификационной диссертации Римана.
To deal with the questions of development, you must leave the Department of Mathematics and go into the Department of Physics, experimental physics.
Для того, чтобы правильно рассмотреть вопрос развития, вам надо выйти за пределы математики и перейти уже в область физики.
And when you have proven a physical principle,
А когда вы доказали физический принцип,
you come back to mathematics and you change it.
Вы возвращаетесь к математику и изменяете ее.
You make a new mathematics.
И вы создаете новую математику.
But you cannot derive physics from mathematics. You must derive mathematics from physics.
Бывает физика без математики. Бывает и физика без математики.
Is there any physics without mathematics?
Yes.
Для того, чтобы получить на нее ответ.
Doesn't it think you that you've taken the path of narrowing define the question area so that an answer can be achieved.
No, the point is that it all, as you know, in all scientific work, the ultimate thing is to reduce the issue before you to a simple test of measurement.
Дело в том, что в каждой научной работе очень важно
Самым
сократить.
существенным является поиск способа измерения.
Now the question of measurement is man.
А вопрос измерения является человеком.
For example, how do we know something is true?
Ну, например, как мы знаем, что является что-то правдой или нет?
Formally, I can describe, and many have done that, describe exactly as Riemann does, how you can develop a system of scientific progress in a formal sense.
Например, с формальной точки зрения можно сделать так же, как и Риман. Как можно описать прогресс с формальной точки зрения? Да?
But what's the standard of that?
Каков стандарт? Каков единица?
How do you measure scientific progress?
Как вы измеряете? Какая единица измерения научного прогресса?
You are measuring not nature, you're measuring man's ability to conquer nature.
А вы измеряете не природу, вы измеряете способность человека обуздать природу.
Therefore, the test of whether the human cognitive apparatus is a reliable instrument for conquering nature.
То есть, или вопрос заключается в том, являются ли познавательные способности человека адекватной оружием для покорения природы.
What is the test? The test then comes out.
В чем же заключается испытание? В чем же заключается?
It comes out as a physical economic test.
Это физико-экономический тест.
And we increase mankind's power over the universe by this discovery.
То есть увеличили мы власть человека над природой, получив вот это открытие.
And we increased man's power to exist.
Увеличили мы способность или силу человека к выживанию.
And we increased life expectancy.
Увеличили продолжительность жизни.
And we improved demography.
Улучшили мы демографическую.
And we improved function of the individual.
Улучшили мы функции индивида.
A higher quality individual who lives longer, who is more productive.
То есть это человек, индивидуум более высокого качества, который более продуктивно работает и будет дольше жить.
Is it a method which preserves the achievements of past generations for the benefit of the future?
И сохраняет ли этот метод достижения предыдущих поколений для того, чтобы использовали последующие?
So man is the measure.
То есть человек является.
I think we have to establish one point, which is fundamental.
Все монетаристы говорят альтернативы монетарной теории нет.
All the monetarists repeat constantly, there is no alternative to monetarism.
Вот нужно именно когда нет альтернативы, говорить, есть альтернатива.
We need to be able to say quite clearly when they say there is no alternative, to reply there is an alternative, it's physical economy. That's very natural.
Естественно-научный подход,
This is a natural scientific approach to a social economic system.
The vast territory of Siberia and Russia in general, which has an extremely low population density, and with modern technology can become habitable, even the Arctic region, of course, with enough energy.
Дело в том, что мы можем взять территорию Сибири или России в целом, у которой очень низкая плотность населения, и современными, при наличии современных технологий все эти огромные пространства можно сделать обитаемыми.
It cannot become economically habitable without large-scale transportation networks.
Но с точки зрения экономической, эти регионы не могут стать обитаемыми без наличия хорошей системы транспорта.
And a transportation system must not only have a geographic destination, it must have an economic destination.
И транспортная система должна иметь не только географическую точку прибытия, но также экономическую точку прибытия.
So the way to develop Siberia is by having transportation links to South Asia and to China, which are the great concentrations of world population.
Дело в том, что можно развивать Сибирь, прокладывая через нее дороги в Южную Азию и в Китай, в котором огромное население.
This is strategically necessary for peace on the continent of Eurasia under present and coming conditions.
What's the solution? As I said at the outset, the problem today is denial. People are afraid. They're afraid of power. They're afraid of the power of the IMF. They're afraid of the power of the United States. And therefore, they say we have to play by the generally accepted rules among the nations of the IMF and by the United States. Therefore, when you try to solve a problem, you say, we have to find a solution within the rules. You can't violate the rules. You've got to find an alternative within the rules. But what I've indicated to you, there are no solutions within the rules. This has been a long-term process of decadence, of culture and economy. We no longer have the kind of leaders in politics we had 20 years ago or earlier. Our people coming out of our universities do not have the competence of people coming out of the universities a generation ago. We are in a decadent culture, a decadent system, which is destroying us. And you're not going to find solutions in a system which has shown that its axioms, the definitions, axioms, and postulates of the system ensure destruction. But people say, but you've got to go by the rules. What are the rules? The rules are precisely the rules, the axioms, the definitions, the postulates which have destroyed us. Why can't we change the rules? Aren't we human beings? Don't we represent nations which have get this out of the first chapter of Genesis. Is man and woman not made equally in the image of the creator of the universe and endowed with these powers? Do not we have the authority above anything on this planet to change the rules? We have the power. That's what sovereignty means. Sovereignty means the power to make the rules by which we can survive. That doesn't mean we can make any rules we want to. It means we have to have responsibility and competence, but we have the right to deliberate. We in the United States are in a mess, a terrible mess.
Nós nos Estados Unidos estamos em uma bagunça tremenda.
We have great power still, but it's a sham. A sham.
Somos hoje uma grande potência, mas na verdade tudo isso é uma fraude.
Without a revival of the economies of the South and Central America, the United States cannot work its way out of its own onrushing depression.
Como a maioria dos países da América Central, os Estados Unidos não podem sair sozinhos dessa confusão em que se meteram.
Either we shall sail together or we shall sink together.
Ou nós nos salvamos juntos, ou nós vamos pro buraco juntos.
And what I can hope to contribute most of all, apart from what I do inside the United States and elsewhere,
E o que eu espero é poder contribuir de tudo que eu sei do que está se passando nos Estados Unidos em toda a parte,
is to try to provoke among us as nations a dialogue on these great issues.
É tentar provocar entre nós um diálogo entre nações, um diálogo entre tradições.
We must not have a hegemonic system.
Não temos que ter um sistema hegemônico.
A slave is a poor worker.
Escravo é trabalhador fraco, trabalhador ruim.
If you cannot evoke the willpower and creative mentality of a nation's people, you cannot get much good out of them.
Se você não pode provocar o poder criativo, o poder da vontade nas pessoas, não se pode esperar nada delas.
Some may be more powerful, some smaller and weaker.
Algumas poderão ser mais poderosas, mais fortes, outras poderão ser mais fracas, mais débeis.
But all must be treated as personalities with equal rights.
Mas todas devem ser tratadas como personalidades com direitos iguais.
From each we must demand the same thing. They muster their creative power to help solve problems.
E da mesma forma elas devem desenvolver capacidade de resolver os seus próprios problemas.
We need above all a community of ideas, a community of principle.
Precisamos, acima de tudo, uma comunidade de ideias, uma comunidade de princípios.
We want to eliminate all kinds of supranational control over any nation among us.
Temos que eliminar todo e qualquer tipo de controle supranacional sobre as nações de todo o mundo.
And finally, look at Brazil.
Finalmente, olhem para o Brasil.
This wonderfully large, virtually untouched wilderness.
Esta magnificamente grande e virtualmente intocada imensidão.
With some concentrations of development, but vast undeveloped areas.
Com algumas áreas desenvolvidas, mas vastas áreas subdesenvolvidas.
Symbolized by the sheer might of the Amazon River.
Simbolizadas pela grandeza da bacia amazônica.
If you look at the Amazon region from the standpoint of the great Russian scientist Vernadsky, who divides the terms biosphere and noosphere.
Se vocês olharem para a grande região amazônica, sob o ponto de vista do que o grande cientista russo Vladimir Vernadsky definia como a biosfera e a noosfera,
you have a sense of the great power for the future implicit in the development of that in a scientifically sound and rational way.
Vocês poderão ter uma ideia, um sentido do enorme potencial de desenvolvimento daquela região ainda em grande parte inexplorada.
That is one of the great projects of development for the planet as a whole.
Esse é um dos grandes projetos de desenvolvimento para o planeta como um todo.
And it should be a source of inspiration to all Brazil about what this nation can do.
Isso deveria se tornar uma fonte de inspiração para todos os brasileiros sobre o que esse país pode se tornar.
And the United States should be very happy to have such a partner.
E os Estados Unidos deveriam se tornar muito felizes em ajudar tal empreendimento. Muito obrigado.
I wish to extend my gratitude to the Institute, to the Center, and to His Highness for the invitation to be here with you today. My subject is the Middle East as a strategic crossroads. The world has come to a crossroads in modern history. If the world were to continue along the pathway currently chosen by my government and some others, civilization will be plunged for as long as a generation or more into a global dark age comparable to that which struck Europe 7.5 centuries ago. We must not pretend that that danger does not exist. We must commit ourselves to the hopeful alternative which wise governments would prefer. Therefore, I should speak frankly but optimistically of a second crossroad, the Middle East. Whatever U.S. policy might appear to be now, the reality of the present world economic crisis will probably force some sweeping changes in U.S. policy and thinking during the near future. There is no hope for the economic revival of the United States from the present world crisis without precisely such cooperation in the land transport-based development of the Eurasian and African continents as a whole. If the U.S. is to find a solution to the inevitable early collapse disasters caused by its present policies, this must include a special role for the Middle East. The approach to a solution to that strategic crisis does not lie in oil as such, but in the way petroleum production and marketing can be applied to serve the broader long-term interests of the region. Stable governments within the region and stable relations within areas outside the region are the first line of defense of the region from the forces and other perils which presently menace it. The crucial role of transport development is a leading example of the measures of defense required. The special advantage of modern rail or magnetic levitation as compared with sea-based transport lies in the elementary fact that with rare special exceptions, the product transported by sea does not improve in itself during transport. Under the right conditions, long-range transportation corridors, which are based on the central role of monorail or magnetic levitation transport, are in net effect cheaper and faster routes of transport than the seas. As in the cases of the original U.S. transcontinental rail systems, these routes were not merely roads of transport. The transportation system transformed a virtual economic wasteland to a rich region of powerful economic development. In effect, every average kilometer or investment in the transportation system along these main and subsidiary routes gave back to the nation a net amount of produced wealth from agriculture, mining, and manufacturing far in excess of the cost of developing and maintaining the transportation system. Instead of thinking of connecting 2 points with a long-distance rail line or magnetic levitation system, think of the transport line as the central spine of a development corridor for up to 50 to 100 kilometers width. Running parallel to the spine are main line conduits of water and power. At appropriate places along the spine, agro-industrial residential complexes are built. Satellite areas of a similar type lie within the same corridor. What I have just described in a summary way is a modern equivalent of the methods which produced an agricultural industrial revolution in the United States approximately a century and a half ago. By concentrating resources of transportation, water, and power within development corridors, the most efficient use of these resources can be managed. The most economical use of the total available land area is achieved by tending to concentrate development in those corridors. Under conditions of continued growth, subsidiary development corridors will branch out from the principal ones. The same method can be applied with a combination of technologies either existing or within reach to transform the interior of Asia, including the deserts and tundras. Under proper policies, the physical net cost of such development corridors is less than zero. As goods flow along the spine of the corridor, new wealth is generated in and around each of the nodal agro-industrial residential locations along the route.
There was a confrontation in the past between producer and consumer. Do you see any hope in the future that both sides can set and plan future cooperation?
I see it up the hope. The hope is precisely this. We are in, as I said, we are in a collapse of the world financial monetary system, a collapse of the economy. We published in my magazine and others, we published the figures on this. It's clear. All the attempts to deny this are becoming undeniable. All right, under such conditions, how would the world recover? Now you're looking at, from your background, which obviously includes this knowledge, you're looking at a system which is no longer a sane financial system. We are now operating on the basis of financial derivatives which run into hundreds of trillions of dollars. We don't know how many there are because they're unregulated market. These are obligations. We have bubbles, all kinds of financial bubbles. We see the collapse of the so-called telecom sector, which is collapsing. So we're into a major bankruptcy now. This means that we are at a point where we can save the economies through cooperations among national governments. But it requires state-to-state agreements of the type we made in terms of the first IMF agreement. If we went back to the model of 1945, 1965, and say, should we do this? Put the world through bankruptcy reorganization. Do the things you do in bankruptcy, as one of the so-called Chapter 11 in the United States. Get government credit mobilized to large infrastructure projects and so on. What do? Well, to maintain that system, we have to have a system of gold reserve-based system. Because we have to have a fixed currency value or peg ratio, otherwise you cannot have cheap loans, 1 and 2% in international markets on the long term. Under those conditions, the next thing you go to is certain categories of trade. Now this means that, as I've indicated, the price of petroleum should be a negotiated price between consumer and producer nations, among them, which should be fixed because we will now be fixing energy, which is the biggest key commodity in international markets. We fix that to the rate of currency. Now we can have an economy that will work, and we can invest. So therefore, we have to go to a fixed currency system, which includes precisely that kind of thing that we used to think we had before 1971. We have to go back to that. And I presume that under conditions of a crisis, when governments admit there's a crisis, then they will be willing to come together as governments and say, let's make a new system based on the best experience from the previous system. And under that condition, that would happen. What is our interest as a total person if we know we will all die? It is what we do with our life. It's what's said in the New Testament about the parable of the talents. You are given a talent. It's a life. What are you going to do with it? What you do with that life is what you are for the rest of eternity. The people who are effective leaders of nations have that kind of love for their people and for the people of the world of that kind. Because they have a mission. It's given to them. This ability to have this thing, this commitment to immortality, is something that's given to you. Life is loaned to you from birth to death. And what you do with that life becomes what you are. That's your interest. Are you giving justice? Are you acting for the future of mankind? Do you have the eyes of the past dead upon you? Do you have honor in the eyes of those who died and went before you? So you never elect a leader as a leader and trust him as leader unless they have that kind of moral commitment. We would hope, and I would hope that sometime in the future, we would not need to find that such leaders were exceptions in their people. In the meantime, we count on such leaders to guide, or people who can approximate that, to lead us and lead the people through the swamps of danger.
Thank you, Lyndon LaRouche, and thank you for helping us celebrate your 100th birthday in the appropriate fashion. If you've just joined us, you are listening to the Schiller Institute's International Conference, Inspiring Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. This is panel 3, presenting the digital LaRouche Library, LaRouche in Dialogue with the Nations of the World. We will take questions from the audience. After the presentations are finished, you can send those questions in to questions@schillerinstitute.org, and we will take them up as soon as we finish with the last 2 presentations. Our next speaker is John Sigerson. He is known to many of you as the director of the Schiller Institute Chorus. He's also the head of the LaRouche Library Project, and he has orchestrated the numerous technical and other components of this effort to make it possible to launch today. In short, he's the man who made it happen. He will now cut the ribbon and give you the first guided tour of the LaRouche Library. John?
Thank you, Dennis. Before I give the unveiling, I'd just like to point out that as you've just heard, Lyndon LaRouche's compositions, his both written and his speeches, everything that he's done really remind one of Beethoven's compositions, his great compositions, and his great fugues. And the way that you must read these is not just to read the words, but as Lyndon himself said so often, repeating the words of the great conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler, that you have to read between the words. Just like when you're listening to a piece of music, you listen between the notes. And this, I think, I hope that the way that we have organized the the LaRouche library, which you were just about to see, will help you go through that. Just to give you one example, many search engines will mostly give you, and when you search for it, it'll give you the number of occurrences and rate it according to, you know, their own idea of what's the most important. And they put that up, throw that up first. Instead of doing that, what I've done is organized it in such a way that you'll see the search results chronologically. That is, from the earliest occurrence of something that you search for to the later one. The reason why is because that gives you a sense of the course of LaRouche's thinking through his life on these various matters, so that you can follow the evolution of his thought, because LaRouche's ideas were constantly evolving. He was constantly making new discoveries and finding new ways, more effective, you might say, conceptual technologies to be able to get to communicate what was in his heart, what had always been in his heart since his very early childhood. Without any more further ado, then let me introduce you. I'm going to share my screen, and you will see the LaRouche library. Hold on one second. And here it is. As you can see, wait one second. Wait. Here we go. What we've done is, this is what you might call a minimalist portal. That is, we're trying to keep it as simple as possible from the beginning, but underneath the hood of this rather simple screen that you see here is an incredibly powerful content management system that we will evolve into a vast offering of thousands of articles, videos, audios, photographs, special reports, and extensive published and unpublished memorandums addressed to leaders of the heads of state around the world. So let's just look at that. At the bottom, you'll see here the number of repository items that we have right now. It's 367. That's a tiny, tiny little portion of what we have. And over here on the right, you'll see that of those, 274, I think Dennis was off by one or something, digital documents, which means PDF, portable document format documents of things that Lynn has written. You'll also see here that there are 4 collections. We've organized as you'll see, we've organized the material in such a way that you have various types of collections, so that you can search within those collections, but you can also search everything among all the collections at the same time. In the middle here, you see the search function, which we'll get into. And then up at the top, you have all of the menu items. Let's just visit the first of the menu items, which I think the most useful one to start with is what this website is about. And there it is. And as you can see, it's the power of reason, with that wonderful, wonderful quote about the fertile engine of ideas, a short statement of purpose, the contact address, and then underneath that, this is the this is where the copyright information is. You can read it, but the major point that I want to make is that with virtually almost no exceptions, all of the material on the website is copyrighted, and so it has ownership. You can use it and download it for your personal use, but if you need to, if you desire to post it, and we encourage you to post it, but you must obtain prior authorization. from the LaRouche Legacy Foundation in order to publicly post any of this material. So let's go back to the home page. And let's look at just some of the other menu items very briefly, and then I'll give you a little bit more after that. The Explore menu simply gives you a listing of all of the current collections, and we have 4. We have the photographs, the EIR magazine, which are the about 200 some odd of articles from that among of the more than 2,000 articles that Lyndon wrote for the EIR, beginning in its founding in 1974. I just have a sample here of the New Solidarity newspaper. We're in the process of getting all of the papers digitized, as Dennis mentioned. So there's just one little sample item here that you can go just to get a taste of what it is. So you've got that. Then we've got the videos. So photographs there. Okay, before we go into it, let's just go through all the other menu items. EIR is a listing of all of the EIR articles. There are many things that I will show you about the interface here, but you can, if you go over here to the right, you can see this area over here. You can see that if you hit the this first thing, it looks like a little grid, is the so-called grid mode of the website, and that this is throughout all of the pages. You can have it showing either in a grid mode, and we'll do that in a second. There we go. And where you'll see thumbnails of the articles, or you can do it in the list mode. The default for the EIR articles is the list mode, because that's usually much easier. Then we have our video collection. And right now, as you can see up here, we have 22 videos available. This is about 30 hours of content. So if you have a weekend, a free weekend, you can spend all of it watching. Some of these videos are quite extensive. Some of them are up to 2.5 hours long, a 2.5-hour briefing by Lyndon LaRouche. They've been, all of these items have been so-called curated. That is, what we've done is we've we haven't just taken the original videos that were taken off of analog media, i.e. videotape, and we haven't just taken them and thrown them up here, but we've actually processed them, we're not cutting anything out, but we've processed corrected the audio, so it's been cleaned up. We've corrected the color in the video. Sometimes it was quite the original because of age. They had faded, or the colors had changed, so we've restored them as best we could. So that's our video collection, and then we have our photographic collection, and we've just picked up, again, this is just the very first, the tip of the iceberg, with 64 photos. You can look at what they are with the titles, but again, if you go over here to the right, you can just click this little eye over here, and you can just see them all like this if you wish, and look at any one of them. For instance, let's just do this. Let's look at this. This is one of, no, let's look at the second one here. This is his debate with Abba Lerner. And if you have a scroll wheel, notice that you can move that scroll wheel on your mouse up and down. And you can also just grab and move things around. And the reason why I want to do that is notice Mr. Abba Lerner nervously fidgeting with a little piece of string. I'm wondering why he's fidgeting. So that's that. Now, let's look a little bit more at the functionality of the whole website. Notice that I'll just mention, if you hit all, that's a place where it lists absolutely everything that's on the website. And that allows you to so-called filter. these use what's called a filter in order to be able to search things. So there are two ways of searching. There's a way, I'll show you first how to just do a general search that you're probably more used to, but then also if you click over here on the filter button on the right, I hope you can see that, that brings up a something up here at the top here. You can see that filter results, and I'll go through this in a little bit. But let's go back to the search from the home screen. Notice you can also search right from here, right from up here. And also, after you run a filter, you can also search down here as well under the filter results. So you can filter for something and then search for within the filter. So this is, as I said, you can get extremely, it's extremely powerful, but simple at the same time. Let's just do a search, and I just want to show you one thing which will help you in your search efforts. This is something that some of you may know or not. I'm going to type the word Friedrich Schiller. Okay, and I'll hit the search button. And as you can see, we have 71 results up here on the top on Friedrich Schiller. However, I want to point something out. This shows all articles which have the word Friedrich and the word Schiller both in the document. But what if some of these documents have somebody else named Friedrich something else, but it also talks about Schiller? Well, in that case, indeed there are, because Lynn talks about other people whose name is Friedrich in the context of talking about Schiller. So I'm just going to change this a second. So instead of 71 results, if I put Friedrich Schiller in quotes, this, if you've done Google searches, you're probably familiar with this. Put it in quotes, and I'm going to hit search again. Notice you only have 63 results now, because this shows everything just with those two words right next to each other, Friedrich Schiller. And you can go in, and with any one of these, you can go down like that. And notice, by the way, I'm going back again. Notice that they're in chronological order, starting with 1979 and going on up through 2014, which is the last ones. This just goes up to 2008. Let's try another. Let's try another search. Let's search for one of Lyndon, not Lyndon's enemies, but for an enemy of all mankind. Actually, his name was Milton Friedman. Okay, you can just hit the return button and that should get it. Yes, there you go. Well, if you want to know what Lynn thinks about Milton Friedman, there you go. Now, and then you can make this a little bit smaller so you can see it. Oh, smaller. There you go. And you can read it from here. Okay, but also notice the other things about Milton Friedman. It's useful. This one, extremely important. October 1978. This is when Lyndon, when there was first this idea put up by Helmut Schmidt and others in Germany of the idea of a European monetary fund, which would actually be able to help control what was becoming a completely out of control monetary situation there. Unfortunately, all they accomplished was to create a kind of a snake, and Lyndon had completely different ideas about this. He wanted to build this into a real version of his International Development Bank, which he had been talking about before. But it never got off the ground. And once the currency rates in the early 1990s went completely out the window, the European Monetary Fund was history, unfortunately. But nonetheless, LaRouche thought at that point that it was a vehicle, and it's well worth reading how Lynn used the opportunities that came up in order to be able to move things into the correct direction. Okay, so that's Milton Friedman, and let's just do one more search here. and go back home. And let's search for a figure in recent Russian history. Primakov, Yevgeny Primakov, who was the well-respected prime minister of Russia in 1998, 1999, until he was fired by the fading Boris Yeltsin. But then he came back into power. He came back as an advisor to Putin once Putin came into power. Very, very important seminal person. And let's look at this one over here, 2001. Okay, because this one, and let me use one of the tools, which is the zoom tool. And let me also go over here. I'm going to click on all down over here on the right on tools and use one of my favorite tools, which is called the hand tool, which allows you then to move things around just with a little hand. And notice that it says that this was a seminar that Lyndon had in December 15th, 2001, right after 9/11, 2015, in Russia, which was hosted by the government economics advisor, Dmitry Lvov, later joined by Dr. Sergei Glaziev. Okay, and let's just do a page fit here. Whoop, you can see that you can fit the page, you can fit the width, which is probably better. And we can see some pictures here, which is really wonderful, of Lynn's visit and his tours of exhibitions here. And there's him giving an address. And there's a picture of this also among the photo collection that you'll see. Oh, and here is a picture of Dr. Sergei Glaziev himself, the younger Sergei Glaziev. And notice that the caption, which I'll blow up here, it says, Dr. Sergei Glaziev, chairman of the Economics Committee of the State Duma, that was his position at that time. I quote, "I hope that his warnings and analysis will be listened to in Russia, not only among scientists, but by those who are in a position to make decisions." And indeed, I think now we can see that Lyndon's ideas indeed are with people on that level. Okay, one more search, and then I'm going to show you a little bit of detail on how these things work. We'll type in. You can have loads of fun with this. Carpetbaggers. Okay, I'm doing this for a purpose, which is that there's notice how much Lynn talks about carpetbaggers. If you want to know about carpetbaggers, it's great. In this case, this is a webcast that he did in the aftermath of the very highly contested election of George W. Bush, which of course was contested by Al Gore. And so it was and this was done right after that in November, right after, in the same month as the election afterwards. And I wanted to just go through a little bit more detail just in terms of the way things work here. Use this as an example. First of all, over here on the left, I'm hitting this. And notice one thing, that if you're scrolling up and down in here, notice that you're just scrolling down this player. Whereas if you move your cursor over here to the right and you're scrolling down the entire page. So it depends on where your cursor is. And you can see you can also go by page here, and you can turn that off. You can search for anything like carpetbaggers. And notice that over here it says 1 of 5 matches. You can go from match to match with the arrows very easily, right? Notice it says match case, whole words, all sorts of things that you can do here, right? Going back, okay. And then you can turn that off by clicking on it again. Here, you can change pages here, and notice that it shows you one of pages. This is, we already went through this in terms of making it larger and making it smaller. Here, over here, further to the right, you have this expand thing, and this will allow you to expand the article all the way through so you can see it completely. If you have a large screen, you can read it right there. You can't zoom into this one, but you can, if you have a large screen, it's very readable. Couple of other things here that are less useful, but the other one, as I mentioned, is this thing all the way at the right, where there are all sorts of different kinds of tools here, especially that my favorite, which is the hand tool, so you can move things around with the hand. Now, going over here to the right, though, I want to point out, you have underneath technical data, you have the original that you can click on and download. Everybody can download it. You have no problem with that. Download it, read it, print it, I don't care. And also, though, there's the extracted text. I should point out that if you hear, hold on a second, I'm going to go back to the selection tool. You can select the text right in the, you can select a paragraph of text right in here. But if you really want to get the text, the easier way is to go to what's called the extracted text. For every document that we've done, we have created not just extracted the raw text, but we have processed it and also done some corrections of spelling inconsistencies, formatting errors, all sorts of things. And I'm going to right click on it and hit open a new tab. That creates a new tab up in our browser window. If I click on that tab, you'll see that this is the extracted text. And again, here we can bring it up. And here would be the best place to actually process to actually select your text and so forth. Some people may find this easier to read. Other people may prefer it to read it on the original. That's up to you. And also, by the way, you can download this extracted text by just right-clicking and save it. So that's it. Further down, you have the metadata. Metadata is the definition of metadata is simply it's data about data, since all of this is data. So this is for every single document, this metadata is done. I would point out a couple of things. First, the description, which usually just says what it is, but notice here it says, for the video version, see below under a related item. I hope you can see that. Let me spotlight it here. Yeah, here, this description. And then you have the persons, organizations that are associated with this document. You have the genre. Every document has a number of different types. This one happens to be a transcript because it's a transcript. If you click on any of these things, by the way, this is another way of searching because you can just click on transcript and it will show you all of the documents that are transcripts. So that's another way of searching or filtering. Okay, and further down, right, you can see the temporal subject, which is basically the year that it was published. We'd like to keep this thing chronological, and if you click on that, you'll get everything that LaRouche issued or that was published for him in the year 2000. Going further down, you have the where it came from, but then here, notice that at the top it says for video version, see under related item, and down here we can get to the video version of it. And so if we click on that URL, we get the video, which is part of our video collection. And you can play that. This is all of our videos are hosted on Vimeo. They all have closed captions. These are automatically generated closed captions. We have not had time to make them all perfect, but they do run, as you can see. I'm not going to play the audio here because for a variety of reasons, but anyway, so you can do that. And also you can make this video your full screen like that if you want. And also if you click on the Vimeo icon, just similar to going to YouTube to play something, you can also have it playing in Vimeo itself. And in Vimeo itself, you can also notice that there's a download item here so that you can, over here, so you can actually download the entire video from here. So on that thing. And okay. Okay. Now let me think. Are we done? Yes, I think that, oh yes, no, I want to show you one thing. Okay, let's go back to the all. And notice here we have these filters. Let's just look at these filters for a second, just to get an idea of how they work. As I said, you have the genre, you have a fixed number of different types of genres, so that, for instance, if you want to look at everything that's an interview, you can click interview, and it will show you all of the items that are interviews that Lynn did. And hold on one second. And further down, you can have the temporal subject, which will show everything that Lyndon wrote or came out by Lynn in a particular year. All right, gives you 1977. And notice that I click again on it to make it go away and get it. And then further on, you have the subject. I should just point out that the subject, the subject system that we've used is based on the daybook electronic data processing specifications that Lyndon LaRouche himself devised and wrote many memos about, which will be posted, about in terms of how to create a useful intelligence system for intelligence gathering and processing. We could not implement the details of his daybook system on this website, but what I've done is try to create a series of 41 subject areas, which as closely as possible approximate the his full daybook system, which eventually we intend to reestablish and reuse. And then later on, and at the end, we have the geographic subject, which is simply the area, and you can see it goes all the way from from a particular country to the universe, because many things that Lynn talked about have to do with, for instance, I think, let's see, is there? Yeah, there's one on Mars here. So you can see 3 items about Mars. And so you can go and find out about Mars. There we go. And that ends my presentation. I will stop my share now, and I hope that that gives you at least a running start. It certainly gives us a running start. This will be a years-long project. It will involve the work of many, many people, and it's going to require a lot of funding in order to be able to get this this project completed. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That is an excellent start for all of us. This is the panel number 3 of the Schiller Institute International Conference. This panel is called Presenting the Digital LaRouche Library, which you just had presented to you, LaRouche in Dialogue with the Nations of the World. You can send your questions to questions@schillerinstitute.org. And our final presentation today is from Gretchen Small, who is the president of the LaRouche Legacy Foundation. And she has worked closely with her fellow LLF board members, Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Megan DeBroat, over the course of recent months to prepare volume 2 of the print version of the collected works of Lyndon LaRouche. Gretchen?
Now we come to the other major project which the LaRouche Legacy Foundation has embarked upon, publishing LaRouche's collected works in a form worthy of such an outstanding thinker, in elegant and sturdy editions which you can pass on to your grandchildren and that will last in library collections for decades. Many of you, I hope, have seen Volume 1, which included 4 of LaRouche's major economic works. I'm happy to report today that Volume 2 is closing in on being ready for the printer. This volume focuses on LaRouche's writings on culture, a subject which was as central to his entire life's work as his economic discoveries, and in fact, inseparable from them. He wrote in his article, Politics as Art, written in the year 2000, and one of the more than a dozen articles to be published in this volume. And here I quote, "My life's professional work during more than 50 years to date has been focused on precisely that subject matter so urgently needed under today's conditions of global crisis, the interdependency of the history of politics and economics with those classical methods which underlie competence in both art and science." LaRouche often referred to the 3 original and interdependent discoveries of physical principle which he made during his breakthrough period of 1948 to 1952, a set of principles, the development of which then dominated the rest of his life and accomplishments. The second of those discoveries was his rigorous proof that the loud claims of Immanuel Kant and advocates of information theory, that art and science exist in distinct universes, are utterly false. LaRouche wrote, "From the outset of my investigations during the 1948 to 1952 interval, I have concentrated upon the identity of the nature of creativity as we encounter it in the form of valid revolutionary discovery of physical principle, and also in the form of metaphor in classical forms of poetry, drama, and music." He wrote that in his contribution to the release of the Italian translation of the Schiller Institute's music manual in Milan and Rome in 1996, a short gem also included in Volume 2, titled Music and Scientific Creativity. In that same piece, LaRouche called his lifelong dedication to that concept a choice of vocation. So you can understand the difficulties that come up in selecting which of his many wonderful and quite varied writings on this central subject to include in one volume. Our aim, therefore, became that of selecting a breadth of articles, from which, when read as a whole, a serious reader could rediscover for themselves the power of LaRouche's initial discovery and its implication for statecraft, economics, politics, for the development of their own intellectual strength, and for our ability to share a hearty laugh at humanity's foibles, even under the conditions of life we face today. Many people think of culture as a secondary question, often as mere entertainment, and that classical culture is only for snotty rich people who don't give a hoot about humanity. Not Lyndon LaRouche. He stated at the outset of his 1998 masterpiece on the substance of morality, and I quote, "Scientific and technological progress as such are indispensable for the continued progress of the entirety of our species. However, when and whether progress or even retrogression occurs is never automatic. The actual outcome is a result of what we term cultural factors. It is cultural factors which govern even scientific and technological progress as such, and which also govern the manner in which discovered physical principles are fostered and realized. In other words, these issues are key to humanity's survival." He warned that the most powerful technological cultures will be doomed if they do not rediscover the principles of culture which correspond to human creative mentation. During his 5 years in federal prison on trumped-up charges, LaRouche composed a groundbreaking study on the subject of metaphor to demonstrate how the fraud of the dominant modernist dogma, which usually parades under such various names as systems analysis, linguistics, and information theory, was even then so crippling the cognitive functions of Americans that we were becoming incapable of self-government. He countered to that pernicious dogma a rigorous development of the concept of metaphor, insisting it must be in art as in science. Truthfulness is Socratic irony, and truth is a metaphor. Accompanying those two fundamental studies in the volume are a set of articles demonstrating how classical principles guide true statecraft. Among them, his rollicking 1999 treatise on Prometheus in Europe, where he once again took up the subject of what art must teach politics, real politics, the nature of man. Here, Lynn offers a method of action for how to rapidly rebuild the practice of classical thinking, a guide for how to educate a small minority of the citizens who will in turn educate others, who will in turn educate still more to think classically, what he called a chain letter sort of organizing process, which can save our republic. But watch out. He admonishes that if the American citizens wish to save themselves, they must face up to the strategic importance of knowing how to read a poem. Another set of articles chosen for this volume concentrate on music, a subject very close to Lynn's heart and mind. One of these is his November 1988 work, Beethoven as a Physical Scientist, written in the midst of preparing for his trial, in which he insists that the lost language of classical composition can be reconstructed, and wrote that doing so is one of his, and here I quote, the leading projects which this aging writer is determined to see completed before he shuffles off this mortal coil. You see, we have a responsibility to complete his attention, and therefore we paid special weight in this volume to his numerous works on this subject. LaRouche considered great musical composition, with Beethoven's work as a paradigm, to be, quote, the science of celebration of the principle of creative life. And he went to work every which way he could to help musicians, poets, politicians, and citizens everywhere to be able to share in that celebration. Volume 2 of his collected works aims to allow an even greater audience to taste the joy which comes from realizing how beautiful a universe it is, how loving a creator who could allow a mind like that of Lyndon LaRouche to flourish.
Thank you, Gretchen. We've now finished with the presentations of panel 3 of this conference, presenting the digital library, the LaRouche Library. We're going to go to the question and answer period. We have approximately 30 minutes. There are a number of questions that have come in, but I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to ask the first question myself. It actually combines some written questions that we did receive, and this is directed to Helga in particular. A couple of the questions that came in were, when have Lynn's ideas actually been applied to the development of a physical economy? Where have these things happened? The broader question, which I want to pose to you, has to do with the power of ideas, or as he put it in his autobiography, the power of reason. Many of you may be familiar with this triptych or trifold. If not, we can get it to you from the LaRouche Legacy Foundation website, which includes some quotes of people around the world who have turned to LaRouche's ideas. One, that perhaps the most famous one, is that from López Portillo, the former president of Mexico, where he says, "It is now necessary for the world to listen to the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche." On the backside, we have Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General of the United States. "Mr. LaRouche will certainly find his place in history. He was treated unfairly in his life for his vision and his work. His courage is especially notable." We have the rather touching and significant letter that was sent to Helga on the occasion when Lynn passed away for the memorial in his honor. This came from Sergei Glaziev, important Russian economist, academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences, where he said, and I'm reading from this statement from 2019, he says, "Lyndon LaRouche has left us. He was a titan of thought, a man of incredibly encyclopedic knowledge, great soul, and love for humanity. He will always remain in our memory as an ardent fighter for mankind's happy future, based on implementation of the principles of physical economy, a realistic school of economic thought directed towards the creation of material benefits and the conditions for socioeconomic development. He says LaRouche enjoyed enormous respect among the expert community in many countries around the world. I've had the opportunity to meet his supporters in India, Latin America, China, Africa, and of course in Europe and the CIS countries. One would hope for this international expert community, inspired by the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, to be preserved. Today, those ideas are coming to life in a new world economic paradigm, which we call integral, for it unites the interests of the peoples of various countries in the harmonious development of humanity. Close quote. So, Helga, the broad question to you, the significance of LaRouche's ideas, where they have been applied, and where does this take us moving forward?
Well, I think the obvious examples of many which come to mind, Lopez Portillo, whom you quoted, he actually called Lynn to come to Mexico in 1983 when the peso was under attack and there was a huge capital flight out of Mexico and the Mexican economy was tremendously threatened. So Lopez Portillo invited him and we went to Mexico and met with Lopez Portillo, who asked Lynn if he could write him a program to defend the Mexican economy against this attack. And Lynn then, not only wrote a program for Mexico, but he included all of Latin America, and he developed not only measures how Mexico and the peso could be defended, but how the industrial integration of the entire Latin American continent could occur. And this program was called Operation Juarez. In the tradition of the collaboration of Benito Juarez and Lincoln. Then, this was in the summer, and then on the 1st of September, Lopez Portillo implemented the first aspects, namely capital control. He went to go in the direction of a national bank and issue credit for development. And it just happened to be, this was so funny, that on that very day, Lynn and I had a meeting with the board of the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in Frankfurt, who, had a better tradition in the past, playing a role in the reconstruction of Germany in the post-war period, which was based on the ideas of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation of Roosevelt. Now they're more green and not so positive anymore. But, so we were standing there having a, welcome coffee, and the top trader of Frankfurt stormed into the room and said, look, the banks are bankrupted, Wall Street is going bankrupt, Mexico just implemented capital controls, they're probably going for the debt bomb in all of Latin America. So he was completely freaked out, and there was a significant turmoil in, the group. And then Lynn said very calmly, he said, don't worry. We are trying to save the banks by forcing them to reorganize in an orderly fashion. And then he explained, what was behind this policy of Lopez Portillo. Then, unfortunately, Lopez Portillo could not stay long in office because there was a change in government. And also, at that time, Brazil and Argentina did not act in solidarity, which was really the big problem. And unfortunately, Argentina shortly thereafter had to pay the price when the British started to go after the Malvinas. They call it Falklands, but it's actually the Malvinas. But in any case, this was a very successful attempt to implement Lynn's ideas. And then naturally, we met with Indira Gandhi twice, and she started to implement the program, which again Lynn had written and commissioned for her, the 40-year development program for India, which after she was assassinated was then continued by Rajiv Gandhi. And, we kept very close contact with many people of her cabinet afterwards. You saw some of the pictures earlier, K.R. Ganesh and Ganesh Shukla. And there are many other examples. But I would say maybe the most interesting one, since you also mentioned Sergei Glaziev, you mentioned the beautiful letter he wrote for Lynn's memorial. I just got a fantastic other article by him, which is actually a greeting to the 100th birthday of Lynn. This conference and the Festschrift, which I have posted on my Facebook account. It's linked there, so if people want to see it, you can go to my Facebook and look for it. And what he says there is really very, very important, because he says, that if the world would have listened to Lyndon LaRouche, a lot of the pain which we are suffering now in terms of the social upheaval as a result of the economic crisis would not have happened. Because if, Lynn warned, and Glaziev describes it in great detail, warned of all the problems of the financial system, the gap between the physical economy and the financial aggregates, which Lynn so pedagogically well portrayed in his famous triple curve. And then he basically says that, however, now the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche are being implemented by the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in collaboration with the Eurasian Economic Union, and that all the countries which are economically successful today are actually working with the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. And I think this is really, really very, very good, because, in a certain sense, that is the reason why this Legacy Foundation webpage is so useful, because we want to get a lot of people to study the principles of physical economy. Sergei Glaziev naturally is probably the best economist of Russia, and he's working with the Chinese on a new economic system and a new currency, also using apparently what I could see from other written publications, using a lot of the ideas of my late husband. So I think that, I think we are seeing right now the implementation of Lynn's ideas in real time. And I could only hope that people in the West, who clearly who have lost the way, so to speak, that they really would reflect why the neoliberal system is not functioning. They should study the reasons with the works of Lyndon LaRouche, and then also start to learn what are the principles of physical economy, which, is not so far off from the periods when the economies in the West did function, like the American system of economy developed by Alexander Hamilton, which, by the way, is very close to what the Chinese are doing today. So if people would stop having these idiotic blindfolders and prejudices, they would recognize that the principles of the success of the early American Republic and what the Chinese economic miracle is accomplishing are very, very close. And Friedrich List, who is the German economist who is closest to this tradition, he is the most read foreign economist in China today. So, I think it's really the time to review all of that and use these absolutely important ideas to fix the world, which is in such a terrible crisis right now. And I want to thank Dr. Glaziev for having sent this incredibly beautiful assessment of my husband's work.
Okay, thank you, Helga. We're getting a number of comments in. One I would like to read because it's brief and indicative of what many people are saying. This is a comment from Paraguay. I just wanted to say that despite the fact that so many decades have gone by, the thinking of Lyndon LaRouche remains totally valid today. Now, I have a question, two questions, which are really one, which I would like to direct to both John and Gretchen. The first is from Liliana Gorini, the head of the LaRouche movement in Italy. I knew I would get a question from a fellow interpreter. Here's what she says. It's very inspiring to watch LaRouche's hearing at the Peru Finance Committee, and it reminded me of his hearing at the Italian Finance Committee at the Italian Parliament in Rome in 2007, which was also translated by a professional interpreter like the one in Poland. I could contact the Italian Parliament to find out if they still have the recording of that hearing so that it could be included in the LaRouche library. Parentheses, very good idea. She continues, he also had a hearing at the Italian Senate, which is reported in the official Senate record, but only in a written form and in Italian. Does the library include also other languages? And a related question from Peru, from member of the Schiller Institute LaRouche Youth Movement, Sebastián de Bernardi Ruiz Eldridge. He says, hello, this is a great initiative. I hope the youth will begin to use it. I wanted to know if the LaRouche Library is going to be in other languages as well. Thanks. So go ahead, John. Why don't you start and then Gretchen?
It has the technical capability to do that. We're going to need a lot of. Right now we're focusing on obviously Lynn's English language material because there's so much of it. I think there is provision for other languages in the website, so it certainly can be added at a certain point. We just have to figure out. We'd have to add the manpower of the LaRouche Legacy Foundation in order to have people who can work in those various languages. So it's something that can be done. I think we should do it. I just don't know how quickly we can do it.
Okay, Gretchen?
Just add to that I think that this is something that the youth movements around the world, in Ibero-America, in France, in Germany, we have to begin to think about preparing for when we're going to be able to put this onto the LaRouche Legacy Foundation and start assembling the material. I mean, this is a huge amount of work that went into producing what we've been able to do so far. And I think it's urgent that people begin coordinating. If we have a committee, for example, in the Ibero-American youth who would want to work with some of the people who do this, get a list together so that we know what we have in terms of the translations of Lynn's works. We have videos. We certainly have done articles over the years, and those kind of things. Put that together and begin preparing as the future curators of when we can post it on the LaRouche Foundation itself, whose conception is to last for all time. I mean, the idea here is to make sure that LaRouche's work is not lost, and for other generations. But I think in doing that, for example, in the Ibero-American work, right, which I know more about, it's a way of beginning to actually go through and get a higher level perspective of what LaRouche was doing, because often people read one article, another article, watch a video or whatever. When I'm working on volume 2, it was a wonderful thing to have to do, because I had to go through, Megan and I had to go through a number of these articles of a far larger list. John was involved in preparing the list of those. And so you had to read Lynn, and you had to read him in a bulk form, and you had to think about the unity of his thought and the various ways he went at developing that. A little bit what John was saying about the chronological understanding of how Lynn's thought developed. And that's a wonderful thing. That's what I was thinking of in terms of, if you read simply a selection of 12 to 14 articles, you come out with a higher level, a higher order view of how Lynn looked at it than if you read them one by one. And I think beginning to that task of assembling the work, thinking about it, there are various ways we can begin posting things as people put it together. mean, the German sites, the French sites, have an Arabic site, Swedish sites, a Danish site, Spanish, of course, Chinese site, Russian site, which have aspects of this, but begin to think about it in a more systematic way. I think that would be extremely important to do and very valuable intellectually for the development of the youth movement.
Let me add a comment on this, especially picking up on that last point that Gretchen was just making. One of the things we are absolutely committed to in this project is total fidelity to what Lyndon LaRouche said and wrote and so on. When John talked about the curating process, this is one that's designed to absolutely preserve what Lynn said or wrote in both archival form for preservation and also presenting to the public. So the question of fidelity becomes extremely important as part of our stated mission. That poses a particular challenge. And I mention this because Lynn himself often commented about what happened after Leibniz's death, which is that all sorts of quote unquote Leibnizians or neo-Leibnizians appeared with the purpose of destroying his work. And there's no question that the same idea will appear and has appeared already with regard to Lyndon LaRouche. Despite the fact that Lynn himself clearly stated, and is evident from everything you've seen, that Helga is in fact the head of the LaRouche movement, there have been those who have tried to deviate in a direction which Lynn himself would have either laughed at or spat at or both. That said, this question of fidelity is extremely important and challenging for the translator and the interpreter. We will, and we must, and we will get to the point of being able to present LaRouche's works in numerous languages, but that poses an enormous responsibility to those of us who have made the effort to try to render these things into other languages. For probably the single most challenging intellectual task, speaking personally, has been to translate or try to translate Lynn into Spanish. And it's enormously rewarding. So I can only second Gretchen's proposal that this be taken up by the LaRouche youth movement, that this is exactly implicit in what Sebastián had to propose. This is obviously required. And this sort of work will both guarantee that those works are rendered and made available in other languages, and we will technically be able to do that. But most importantly, by such activities, train and educate an entire new generation to stand and wield the power of LaRouche's ideas as he did throughout his life. We have time for one specific question, which I'm going to direct to Helga, which actually came over to us from panel 1, but I think it's very important at the strategic moment to pose to her, and then I'll have a question which I'd like the three of you to answer in conclusion to conclude at 1 o'clock Eastern time. And now this is a question that was sent in from Germany, Helga. It says, now that the Queen has passed away, can we talk about the collapse of the House of Windsor? One hears again and again that King Charles III, not possessing sovereignty like his parents, will rather yield to the pressure coming from outside. We always talk in our conferences about the end of the financial system and already have the solution ready with the new Bretton Woods. How do you see this situation, which I address as a question to you and to this conference?
Well, I think this late King Charles III is not the most jubilant representative of the monarchy one can imagine. As a matter of fact, even the British press has been writing that he lacks charisma, he lacks the kind of, statue which they attribute to Queen Elizabeth. I don't know, I'm not so fond of her statue either. But I think he will have a hard time. I mean, look, Great Britain right now is socially exploding. The trade unions, railway and others are protesting and striking. We are in a breakdown crisis. So, I think it's very difficult to predict. The combination of Charles being king, and we have published many of the quotes where he came out as a complete Malthusian, as a complete proponent of the Great Reset and the green policies, which would reduce the world population potential by billions if it would ever be implemented. So he is now king. Liz Truss, the prime minister, came out and said on the question if she would be prepared to use nuclear weapons, she said, yes, absolutely, this belongs to the tasks of the prime minister, not even considering, what is the consequences and that this could be the end of humanity. And then there is another new development where, as an option, the present vice prime minister of Canada is mooted as the successor of General Secretary of NATO Stoltenberg. And she is, not exactly, she's not exactly the opposite of a war hawk. So that combination would be really very much a factor in more warmongering and so forth. But then on the other side, I think that the primary issue of the next period will be the blowout of the neoliberal system. The inflation rates in many countries are around 10%. The energy and food prices are going through the roof. Energy prices becoming completely unpayable for many people. I think that this is the kind of period where, and I mentioned that yesterday, where the spreading of ideas of Lynn's solutions is the most crucial, because this is a period where people reflect on the fact that that things are not working. Look at this so-called economic minister of Germany, Habeck, who is a green, a philosopher, who has all kinds of ideas, but he has really no knowledge about what an economy of the fourth largest industrial nation in the world requires. And he was, up in the polls and praised, and now he's becoming the punching bag for everybody who is frustrated, and that's just the beginning. So we are in a period of greatest turmoil, and I think this is the period where all the ideas we have been discussing in the last 36 hours or so are extremely relevant. So I'm really hoping that the people who are watching this conference would come forward and be volunteers and help us to put the 4 laws of LaRouche on the table. The need to go for a global Glass-Steagall banking separation, which some developing countries are already de facto implementing because of the need to have capital controls to protect their economies. Then after Glass-Steagall, or together with Glass-Steagall, we absolutely have to go back to a national banking system in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton. The sovereign control over credit generation has to come back to nation states and not in the hands of the private financiers. Then we need a credit system. A credit system is being developed already by the countries of the global south, the BRICS, the SCO. In a few days, we will have the big summit of the SCO in Uzbekistan, and I expect major proposals to be issued there. And we should discuss this in a rational form with people in the United States and in Europe to enter a meaningful dialogue about the urgent need to fix this poor world. We have an incredible crisis, and confrontation will not solve any problem, but cooperation for constructive ideas, for real development, to go back to the tradition of Franklin D. Roosevelt. The idea, what he intended with Bretton Woods, was to have the increase of the living standard of the developing countries as the only guarantee for durable peace. And that is more urgent than ever before. So I'm really calling on the viewers of this program to enter with us an effort to try to implement the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche and straighten this economy and this poor world out. And I think that that is what we should be doing.
Good, thank you. The final question, which is brief, and it's directed to the three of you, so just a few minutes for a concluding remark, really, is what do you see as the future of LLF activities, LaRouche Legacy Foundation activities, in print, in digital, and otherwise more broadly? I will just preface that by restating what I've said before, and John and others have said, which is that your contributions and your bequests and those of others to the LaRouche Legacy Foundation are absolutely essential for us to be able to carry out this monumental and monumentally important task. So, Gretchen, why don't you go first, then John and Helga for the final last word.
Well, we can decide as we go for one of opportunities. One thing the question just reminded me, we've had one seminar as the LLF, and I think that we can consider that would be, we can have an educational role to play. We've been working on expanding or getting placed in libraries the collected works. We have the first volume out to do that. It has been difficult. The problem you run into is most libraries are run by nominalist information theorists and Aristotelians. And I think the only solution to that, seriously, rather than just throwing the books around, is where I think the best solution to that, actually, particularly in the United States where the books is more available, is that people in local communities who know their librarian, who know their people, who have some standing, who talk to their neighbors. You have to take the responsibility to take a copy of that volume 1 and talk to the librarian and organize them to put it on the shelves. And that would be a very important thing to do. It may not happen in the big cities. If it does, all the better. It has to happen in the universities. But if it happens even in the small towns of America, it will revive the right to deliberate that we were talking about earlier in the conference. The effect of studying Lynn's ideas is really crucial these days, as the Schiller Institute has proven. These are very hard times. I mean, people may have seen I've been working on the Ukraine fascist project. That's not an easy subject to take on. The reading through Lynn's cultural work is an absolute antidote to that, which is what the Schiller Institute is doing. So I think we can consider having more seminars where appropriate, university seminars if someone wants to organize that, and work on the distribution of fight to get the book into the libraries wherever we can. That's it for me.
Okay, great. John.
I forgot to mention something that maybe you saw it on the webpage there, but in case you didn't, the website address for the LaRouche Library is larouchelibrary.org. So that's the place to visit. Also, I should mention that it's already being cataloged by Google, so it will show up in Google results. I don't know what the ratings are for it in terms of how high it's going to be in the results, but it's a new website, and it's my experience with websites that when Google sees something that's serious and is in for the long haul, like for instance the LaRouche Pub website, which has been around pretty much since the internet has existed. That's the EIR website. That they give high ratings to such serious endeavors. So that's the one thing I'll say about that. In terms of the future, first of all, we have an enormous amount of work ahead of us just to process the thousands of videos that some of which are cataloged. Clearly, what we're operating with on this is not just putting these things up one by one. We've got a database which is offline. It's just our own database, which we use to process and track the videos in terms of their progress through the process of curation, from all the way from the raw video on through. That's a tremendous amount of work. It's been a tremendous amount of work with putting up the first 200, I think over 250 EIR articles. But as I say, that's 10% of all of the EIR articles that Lynn wrote. And then of course we have so much more from all the other publications, the campaign articles that he wrote in the Campaigner magazine, and its successor, the Fidelio magazine, 21st Century Science and Technology, Fusion magazine, the one that was shut down illegally by the US government, and many other publications. And that includes books and so forth. So there's just lots of work there. The other thing that we need to, I plan to move on is integration of the collection, similar to other presidential libraries. We want to integrate the collection into the worldwide digital cataloging mechanisms that do exist, such as WorldCat and so forth, so that this will be basically part of the library system, the digital aspect of the worldwide library system, which is quite significant. So this will show up everywhere as just a part of the library system that has yet to be done. So that's the main thing right now is to grow. It has to grow very much. As I say, we have a lot of videos that have not been even cataloged yet. If people have, we would certainly be willing to accept contributions of documents and other things that we might not already have in terms of memos, both public and private, especially things dating back into the 1980s, when our filing system was not as systematic as it later became. We have a lot. One thing that we have not even put up yet is an audio collection. We have hundreds or possibly thousands of audios that are just of LaRouche talking, both over the phone, briefing various people around the world, in some of which we will release, some of which are private. We probably won't release, at least for now. And but also many other types of audio things that, for instance, I personally was at many wonderful evenings of musical evenings that we had with Lyndon, where we would make presentations. I would give presentations, or our friends, musical presentations mostly, and would have long discussions with Lynn about these things. And some of those things we also want to make available to the public at this point. So it's really so much that, in terms of the reason why I talked about the foreign language, is that it's like we're going to have other people who are working on that. And I think the decision would be as to whether to integrate the foreign language capability into the existing website, or to actually create separate websites underneath the LaRouche Legacy Foundation to specifically dedicated to those languages, because, well, there are reasons why it would probably be better to do it that way. So this is an exciting thing. You can send, if you have suggestions as to things that you think ought to be in the archive, please send it to the contact address there, info@larouchelegacyfoundation.org, and get in touch with us. If you have collections of things, Not necessarily the publications. I think we have most of those, but any other semi-public or private things, even if you disagree with Lynn, or you were with Lynn earlier on and somehow you drifted away. Some people have. Fine, get in touch with us. We will put anything up that is significant from Lynn. I would also say that Lyndon LaRouche also wrote many articles in the 1950s and the early 1960s, many things from other publications. And eventually we'll be able to include all of those. There are copyright issues to be dealt with, but we'll be moving on that as well.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Helga, your final remarks, please.
Well, I think that also the work with universities is very important. We already had some professors who had the wisdom to, include Lynn's economic theories in history of economic thought in Brazil, in the Arab world. So I would, encourage students and professors to, approach us and work with us, work with the LaRouche Legacy Foundation, because I'm really convinced that, if the world gets out of this crisis, it will be with the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. And then, the people who are now dominating the universities in the Western world, they will be still available, but they will be read more from a clinical standpoint as those theories which led to the disaster. And the tradition of economic science, which Lynn carried so much further, will be, accepted and become, not something, you have to fight for, but it will become proudly read. And right now, I see the majority of the world going in this direction. So, I think the work with universities, professors, students, writing your doctoral thesis on aspects of Lynn's work, all of that should be discussed and encouraged. So I'm very happy that we were able to launch this incredible, beautiful project.
Thank you very much. And thank you also to not only Helga, Zepp-LaRouche, John Sigerson, Gretchen Small. Thank you all for listening. This is the conclusion of panel 3, presenting the Digital LaRouche Library, LaRouche in Dialogue with the Nations of the World. Tune back in at 2 o'clock sharp Eastern Time. That's a little under an hour from now for panel 4 of the Schiller Institute Conference. The title is The Art of Optimism, Using the Classical Principle to Change the World. Thank you, and see you soon.